Great. And I'll just say, before I turn it over to Secretary Young, my name is David Plum. Welcome, everybody. I'm helping to facilitate this meeting, the Vermont Climate Council. Today, we are on a standard Zoom meeting, which means all of us are all together, whether we're Climate Council members or observers or members of the public. So thanks, everybody, for doing all that good Zoom etiquette that we've learned to do. I will ask a favor of observers today who are joining us, and just in the spirit of trying to keep the Climate Council together, if you're an observer with us, could you go ahead and turn off your camera until we are at the public comment moments? And I'll also ask you to refrain from using the chat if you're an observer with us today until the public comment moments. And we're definitely going to have time for public comment in today's meeting. But just as a way to sort of keeping visually our focus on the council while the council's meeting, I'll ask that observers keep their camera off and refrain from using the chat. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Secretary Suzanne Young, your chair of the Climate Council, to kick off our meeting today. Secretary Young.
Yes, good morning, everybody. As David noted, this is a meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. It's July 26, 2021, and it's the regular meeting. The agenda has been posted on the AOA website. I'm not sure if it's been posted in the chat yet, but hopefully
Jane just dropped it right in the chat. Yep.
Perfect. So folks can take a look at it. You'll see it's a pretty heavy schedule this morning, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the details, but the meeting objectives are at the top of the agenda. We'll go through, we'll approve the minutes or review and approve if everyone's satisfied. We'll do our Just Transitions reflection moment with, it's going to be about 25 minutes with April Mendez from Greenprint Partners. Then we'll open it up to the subcommittee presentations on draft pathways and strategies. So that's pretty exciting. We'll hear from the Rural Resilience Subcommittee and the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee, and then we'll have some time to reflect and discuss, followed by public comment and then next steps. So with that, I will turn it over to well, first I'll ask if anybody has any comments, concerns, or additions that they would like to see on today's agenda. Okay, I'm seeing none and hearing none. David, would you like to kick it off with the minutes?
You bet. Thanks so much, Secretary Young. Okay, good morning, everybody. So as we typically have to do, we need to approve our minutes from the last meeting. They are hyperlinked in the agenda. I'm also dropping them a link directly to them, I think, in the chat. It should go there. Let's just take one moment if folks need to click through that. And if there's anything that you have seen in those minutes that causes you concern, let's just give a minute to see if there's anything problematic there. Okay, great. Any concerns about the minutes from last time? All right, I'm seeing none, so let's take those as approved by you all. Okay, great. So we do have a really interesting meeting today, and it's an interesting milestone. As we like to do, we are starting all of our meetings now with what we're calling this moment of reflection and inspiration around just transitions and equity. And Secretary Moore had heard April Mendez speak a few weeks ago and was very impressed. And because of that, April Mendez is with us today and is going to help us in this moment of reflection and inspiration. April is chief executive of an organization called Greenprint Partners, which partners with cities around green infrastructure like stormwater solutions, as I understand it, April, and please correct me if I'm saying anything not right. And so we've asked April to be with us to reflect on some of her thinking around how you're incorporating equity in work, in this kind of work. And we've got about 25 minutes in total. And so April, I will turn it over to you for whatever words you'd like to offer. And then let's have some conversation on the back end of your thoughts. So April, I'm so glad you could be with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to the council and everyone for having me this morning. I do wonder if I'm going to be able to share my screen. I have a presentation to share with you all. And it doesn't
You should
look like
be able to.
Perfect. We are set now. Okay. Great. All right. As David mentioned, my purpose here this morning is to provide a bit of a moment of illustration and hopefully some inspiration and spark for the council's continued conversations about equity. And I know that this has already been a top priority in the course of your conversations leading up to today's discussion. And my job today, I think, is to illustrate how equity goals can be directly integrated into the design and delivery of climate action strategies, but I'm going to do that through my area of expertise, which is in the area specifically of stormwater runoff management. And my hope this morning is that this does spark or just validate some ideas that you all have on better embedding equity in your climate action strategies. So first, just a note of introduction on my perspective. I'm coming from Greenprint Partners, which, as David said, is a green infrastructure delivery firm. We are mission driven, and that mission is to get the most good possible out of green infrastructure. So you see how equity lands very squarely in that mission. Our context is working in the stormwater infrastructure challenge that the entire country has. Like many other forms of infrastructure across this country, we have legacy sewer systems that were designed in some cases 100 years ago. Those systems are in fairly bad states of disrepair. For stormwater specifically, the EPA estimates that we need $70 billion over the next 20 years to make the necessary upgrades. Those systems are also currently highly centralized, and that makes them fairly inflexible and they encounter challenges in adapting to the changing patterns of both population and climate change. That leads to water infrastructure that is helping to pollute our waterways and flooding our neighborhoods, which disproportionately is impacting low-income communities and communities of color who are already facing underinvestment and a lack of both natural resources in the communities in which they live and a lack of community resources as well. So how green infrastructure fits into this. This is one of the most equitable approaches to addressing stormwater infrastructure challenges. It should be considered along with a gray strategy as a supplement to gray strategies. This is the use of natural systems to manage water right where it falls. So it's not a centralized system. It's something you can build incrementally. It's something that often is situated directly in people's communities, and it changes the face of their built environment. And so it has an opportunity to directly impact people's day-to-day lived experience, especially when truly vegetative practices are being brought in that can improve air quality. They can help reduce stress, help reduce respiratory illnesses, and a whole host of other benefits. We are in a moment together where equity has become a national priority in the wake of COVID-19 and challenges in bias in policing have really brought a clear emphasis nationally as well as within our state and local areas to racial equity as well as to underserved communities, low-income communities, and the challenges that our low-income communities are facing. And we're seeing across the country that stormwater utilities are responding to this. They are taking very seriously the question of how to do a better job in utilizing the investments that they're making, the projects that they're developing, the infrastructure upgrades that they're making, how they can be thoughtful about using those as levers to improve equity across both racial categories and income categories, as well as other vulnerable populations. So what you see here is an example from Seattle Public Utilities, which is in process of kind of rebranding itself as a community-centered utility with racial equity and inclusion for low-income populations embedded directly in their formal statement, which you can see here in the community-centered utility phrasing. An example of this is a program that they are in the midst of launching right now, a pilot public-private partnership to manage stormwater on private properties, where they're currently looking for an external partner to run this program. And they're being very clear that the goals of this program are not just the stormwater performance management, the technical performance, but also those community benefits with priority hire requirements, business mentorship requirements. And a big one for them has really been ensuring that the community themselves are resourced to develop projects instead of just going directly to the professional community to ask them to come up with projects, design projects, et cetera, that the community is being involved and the community is actually being paid to do that. Their expertise and time is being valued. This is just one example of a trend that we're seeing across the country as well. So I want to share now an example of what this looks like on the ground with green stormwater infrastructure. And this is work that is leading to the development of a publication that will come out this winter that's an equity framework for green stormwater infrastructure practice. And this is something that's been commissioned by a membership body of 70 stormwater utilities across the country that have various stages of green stormwater infrastructure programs. So again, indicates the level of scale of the commitment to taking equity seriously in these programs. So I'm going to share just a logic model, and because logic models can be somewhat complicated, we broke this down a little bit into the various parts of the logic model. And here you start on the right with the outcome. So we start with articulating a bold shared vision, which is a vision for what it will look like when we have equity in our communities. And then we pop over to the left-hand side and we ask, where are we starting from? What are our inputs? And then we build a bridge between where we are and where we want to be with the activities that we're going to do and the outputs, that the measurable items that we can ensure our progress against. So now we start to get into the outcomes. We're looking at, from the community side, increasing representation in public decision making, increasing people's employment, their income levels, and their intergenerational wealth building opportunities. So we think about, who owns land, who's going to be generating economics out of the projects that are being built over the long haul. Looking at safety and security emerging through using crime prevention through environmental design principles to ensure that these projects are reducing crime. And then looking at physical, emotional, cognitive health in a way that can support community thriving. Then, of course, we're looking at the ecological impacts, some of which are creating environmental justice issues in these communities currently and need to be flipped on their head. And then finally, we look at the performance measures, which is where we usually start from in stormwater management, but we are intentionally kind of moving that to the back because it's already the top priority. So then we look at where we start. Where are we starting in each community that we're working in? First, we look at existing conditions. What's the current state of equity in the outcome areas that this can influence? Then who do we have to be able to do this work? What are the human resources, the staff, the consultants, the volunteers? And related to that is the social infrastructure, which is often overlooked. This is what level of kind of social cohesion, social capital do you already have in your community? That's organized groups such as block clubs, businesses, schools, congregations, ways that people have already built relationships with one another. So we then don't have to reinvent the wheel. And we can also utilize these project development opportunities to help boost and strengthen those existing social ties. Then we look at what funding do we have and what operational infrastructure is already in place. We're taking an assets-based view to developing strategies. Then we look at the activities. Now we're starting to build the bridge between the outcomes and the inputs. Activities in green stormwater infrastructure include siting and investment. Where are we siting these projects? Are we making sure that the communities that need them most are getting those projects, or are we just doing even equal distribution? And perhaps that is providing the same level of resources to everybody, but it's not taking into account that some communities are at a more of a deficit starting point and actually need more resources to be invested. Then we're looking at community, and this one has been so fundamental in all of the conversations that I've had with utilities across the country. This is the one that they're really kind of fixating on right now, that we need to do better. We're looking at recruiting representative stakeholders from the community. So we think about, who is this project going to be impacting? What's the community that it's going to be located in? And is the group of stakeholders that we're bringing together, in fact, representative of that community from an income perspective, from an age perspective, from a race perspective, et cetera. Then once we have our community stakeholders identified and brought together, we are listening deeply for their priorities. This is a fundamental shift. Generally speaking, when we're doing stormwater infrastructure, we're thinking, how well can this ground infiltrate this water? What are the best management practices, the facilities that we can build here that are going to achieve the final goal? Instead, this is flipping it on its head and saying, yes, we're going to do that, but we also first need to listen to the priorities of the community that's going to ultimately be impacted in the long term by this, and take those priorities into account as we're designing and developing. And then we're consistently communicating throughout the project with the community. Then we're moving into the design and construction of projects. We are making sure that we're designing with those community priorities in mind within the constraints that we have. And then we're ensuring that those priorities don't get value engineered out, that they are in fact reflected in the final design and the build project. Then we're looking at maintenance. A lot of these developments get built and then the maintenance is poor and they actually start to contribute to deterioration in the community. So we need to make sure that they're being maintained for the long haul, and that the folks who are going to be doing that maintenance are trained and supported to be able to do that, including have the funding available to do the maintenance. And then finally, we look at workforce development. This one is particularly fundamental for improving employment and creating opportunities for intergenerational wealth building. We're looking at hiring local and SWMB firms. We're looking at mentorship and apprenticeship programs. And we're also looking at how we source things locally. So I'm going to go ahead and scoot through. This all comes together in this big picture of a logic model that lays out, again, those outcomes on the right-hand side, the inputs on the left-hand side, the activities that I just walked through, and then outputs, which are measurable, the measurable pieces that are associated with each of those that ensure that we're staying on track. So now I'm going to walk through some case studies from our work to illustrate these concepts. The first case study is retrofitting private properties with green infrastructure. And this is specifically focusing on community anchor institutions like schools, congregations, nonprofits, and helping them take advantage of utility incentive dollars to retrofit their properties with green stormwater infrastructure. So you see the image here is a rendering of one of those projects. I want to showcase a little bit how equity is built into the way that we approach developing these projects. First, we're starting with equity-centered site selection. So as I said, we're prioritizing community anchor organizations in particular, but we're also prioritizing those anchor institutions in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. Then we're wrapping around a community activation strategy for every project that we develop. We're putting community in the driver's seat on project design, which requires that we do some knowledge building and awareness building. And then we're also leveraging the fact that that community is doing this project to build community pride and more community awareness by doing broader storytelling and public celebration activities around that. And then finally, the benefits-driven design approach that we're taking is, again, starting with the benefits that the community is going to be prioritizing, which is generally not, I want to keep as much water as possible out of the combined sewer system. That's not the first thing they're thinking. They're thinking, my parking lot is in disrepair. They're thinking, gosh, we've got a lot of stress and anxiety in our community and in the population that we're working with. If this has an opportunity to help us reduce stress or reduce crime, what are ways that we can optimize for that? The results of this project or this case study are a couple of dozen projects built across several cities. We've got a couple dozen more now in pre-development. 75% of those are in low-income census tracts, 90% are in communities, majority communities of color, and 100% of those have been designed in partnership with the communities that they serve. A second case study is a green stormwater infrastructure master planning process in Youngstown, Ohio, which was a collaboration with dozens of local partners and over 150 community members to inform the development of this plan. A couple examples here. We started with local partnerships. We found the Colony Youngstown, which was an emerging nonprofit that already had a lot of street cred, but had very little infrastructure and essentially no paid staff. And we hired that organization based on the social infrastructure that they had built to be a core partner to developing the Green Infrastructure Master Plan. We then recruited and trained an action team of 20 residents who just raised their hand and said, this sounds really interesting. I want to learn more about green stormwater infrastructure. We took them on a tour to Pittsburgh locally so they could see what green stormwater infrastructure looked like when it was built in communities. They could reflect on whether this is something they wanted to see in their own community and developed their own passion around it and their own opinion about it to then be able to share with others. That helped us then launch a citywide campaign, social media campaign, Green is Good, and develop some green infrastructure tours for the residents broadly. And then finally, to do a series of workshops across all of the political wards of the city that those action team members were peer educators for. And in these workshops, it was half education and it was half, okay, let's get out the map and let's hear where you want to see green stormwater infrastructure go and where the challenges are that you want to see it address. And that has led to a set of options for the plan that intersect technical performance opportunities with those community priorities. So they had chosen active living, crime reduction, economic development, and flood mitigation as their additional community benefit priorities for the plan. And so what you see here are different maps that then overlay the data that we collected both from desktop research and from the mapping contributions of the community. Finally, this is a brand new one that I'll mention that we're just getting started in Vermont right now. We're working with Vermont DEC and the Sea Grant to administer a block grant program that will support over 45 Vermont public schools to design green stormwater infrastructure on their properties. The goal of this is to help them comply with the 3-acre general permit rule to improve the Lake Champlain water basin. What we're looking at here, and this is a program that's just getting started, is equitable distribution, including an equity analysis that's helping ensure that the schools that need additional, particularly high levels of additional support, are getting that support. We are partnered with Sea Grant Lake Champlain to do community capacity building and support educational activities at the schools. We're also focusing on ensuring hiring of local firms for each of these projects. And then we've set goals around equitable contracting and have built very proactive strategies into the way we're writing procurement documents and reaching out to potential contractors and then supporting potential contractors who would like to participate. And then the final piece here is just work that we're just getting started on now to translate some of those project level concepts into a broader set of recommended strategies. So I'll just breeze through these and then wrap us up. So these are a few things that green infrastructure practitioners ought to be thinking about doing if they want to seriously embed equity in their work. First, they're needed to make sure that their staff understand equity and are committed and equipped to advance it through their work. Secondly, and this is a big one for everyone we've talked to, community members need to be essential partners and participants in all program, policy, and project development. Usually that's a step that is skipped over, and our engineers and urban planners have a tendency to sit behind desks and get the data that they need, as opposed to going and talking to community members. Third, ensuring that project selection and budget levels are set proactively, considering their potential to advance equity. Fourth, that we're taking gentrification and displacement risk seriously and addressing that proactively in all program, policy, and project development. Five, that when we do construct green infrastructure projects, they are designed, constructed, and maintained with the goal of providing lasting community benefit in mind. Six, ensuring that procurement, employment, and workforce development practices are contributing as much as they can to building economic stability for underinvested communities. And finally, that all policy, program design, management, and reporting are elevating equity, and they're driving transparency, so that we're communicating with the customers that we're serving, the ratepayers that we're serving, about these equity goals and what our true progress has been around them. That's all I have. I'd love to turn to you either for your questions or for your thoughts on what ideas this has sparked or validated for you on better embedding equity in your climate action strategies. And if you have any recommendations for things to be included in the final framework, this is a work in progress, so I value those as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, April. That's fantastic. Okay. So if we take this as food for thought for us in the Climate Council work, as we move towards a climate action plan, and April's final question there, I wonder if folks on the council here have some reactions, having seen this, about how this relates to our work and how we're trying to put equity as a core component of our work and with our guiding principles. Any reactions to that from council members? Or any questions for April? Yep, I see some hands. Erica, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to thank April. I loved your presentation, and it just demonstrates exactly what the charge of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee is, like at the boots on the ground level. So I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation, and we'll likely be reaching out to do some more engagement with you in the future, especially as we further develop some of our strategies related to the pathways that we're putting forward today.
Wonderful, thank you.
Great. Secretary Moore?
I also just wanted to say thank you, April. I enjoyed your presentation both times I've had the opportunity to see it, and different things have jumped out at me. In particular, this idea of intersecting, and probably this speaks to the engineer in me, but intersecting technical performance opportunities with community priorities. And I'm wondering if you have examples you could share, or an example you could share of a time where those didn't line up the way probably the technical practitioners would have liked, and how you sort of move forward in that space. Because I assume there can be community interests that don't necessarily deliver the best technical outcome, and how to balance those interests.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the great examples of that are one's actually where we ceded to the community's priorities and the benefits that they were looking for. So one project that we did in Peoria, Illinois is called the Well Farm, and it's a stormwater farm. Half of that project is using hybrid poplar trees to manage stormwater, a kind of regional approach to stormwater, and half of it is raised beds for food production. And the community really wanted the food production side of it, but we weren't able to, because of health restrictions, get to a solution for using the stormwater runoff to irrigate those beds. And so in that case, we went ahead with the raised beds in any case because it was such a fundamental community priority and it had other equity benefits. So that's one example. In most of the project work that we've done, what we found has been that being clear with the community upfront about what the technical parameters are, what's feasible and what's not feasible, and then showing them a few different design options for integrating their priorities has generally made that almost a non-issue thus far. And I'm sure we'll encounter bigger challenges around it ahead. But the fact that we're starting with listening to community priorities, and we're also educating and recognizing that community members, that's not their job to know the technical performance requirements and the engineering feasibility components. So we have to bring that. And so we educate in a kind way. And then what we generally find is community members are oftentimes very reasonable and have goodwill, like all human beings. And we've not encountered a ton of challenges around that, actually.
Thanks, April. Chris?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm more familiar with the stormwater requirements and work that's been done in King County than Seattle specifically, but could you speak a bit to the kind of the policy frameworks and and even the capacity that the communities that you've worked with have had to even be able to bring you guys in? I guess what I'm looking at is, or questioning, I have a question about is, are there larger policy frameworks and mandates that are driving the overall work that has to be done in the first place, and what kind of capacity are you typically seeing in terms of in addition to the volunteers, like level of staffing in all of these communities where you guys are going into work, who even knew to bring you guys in the first place?
Great. So I'll just clarify first that we're not doing any work for Seattle Public Utilities. The reason we know of their work is because we have been interviewing utilities across the country about their equity practices. So in Seattle, which we're hearing similarly across a number of other cities who really want to engage community-based organizations, and they don't have a procurement framework that allows them to do that. They don't have a grant-making framework, for example, which would be an easier way to be able to engage community-based organizations. What they're doing, and I will say the vast majority of this work, like 99% of this work, is being done by professional engineering, architecture, and construction firms. And so the challenge has been getting community-based organizations to have some kind of a carve out to be able to be resourced to do this work. And what Seattle did in particular is go back to their prime consultant and say, hey, you don't have any community-based organizations as sub-consultants, pretty please, can you, and build them into your budget. So they've been most able to do it through a third-party provider who then subcontracts with community-based organizations. They're also just a lot of people are doing things to incentivize individual community members, like give them a stipend for their participation in public meetings. But there's also non-financial supports that can be provided, like provide childcare, provide food, make sure that's publicized so that people have the barriers removed to their participation, and you're providing some resources to remove those barriers.
We've got just a few seconds more. Catherine and then Sue. Catherine, go ahead, please.
Thanks so much. I was really encouraged and inspired by your presentation about thinking about doing things differently. And then I thought, oh, but wait, we can't, because of this rule that we just adopted for the Clean Water Service Provider, or because of this statute that gets in our way, or because this grant application process doesn't have this as a criteria. How do you break down those barriers that interfere with wanting to do this work differently?
Well, that is a great question, and I wish I had all the answers in the world to it. I think we typically are coming back to when there's a will, there's a way, and some of that way is going to take a long time to get to. But I think drawing your attention to it, focusing on it, being passionate about it, being innovative and creative about the ways that you're thinking about it. I feel like that's a bit of a non-answer, but you already know that from your perspective and what you.
I was hoping you'd have the magic wand.
Right. We're definitely seeing that folks who are drawing that kind of focused attention to those barriers are over time able to shift them. There's a process right now that's going on in Seattle where that is happening. They've got to do some serious work to take down barriers to procurement barriers for equitable procurement. And that's going to take a long time, but they've got so much energy built up around it, and more people are glomming onto it and getting involved, that there's likely to be some kind of change that comes out of that.
Abby, you've got the last word, it looks like. Go ahead, please.
Heaven help us. Thank you so much, April. This was wonderful. I guess I'm going to follow up a little bit on Chris's point. So what I'm noticing about what's happening in Vermont, for example, already is that it's tied into the lake. It's tied into one of the most populous areas in the state, which obviously is where we need to be focusing for a lot of reasons. But this is a systemic issue in Vermont already around the inequities that exist within the funding structures and where resources are concentrated or not. And so I guess I'm curious, to Chris's point and Catherine's point, if there isn't the energy within a community, if there isn't the capacity, how can we as a state ensure that those resources are being distributed equitably? I mean, I'm sure that stormwater infrastructure is equally important in other areas around the state. And I also know that the municipal and town and community capacities in more rural places are really lacking. And that the energy isn't there. And so, I guess I am wondering, not a magic wand, but just if you have any thoughts as to like where there isn't a critical mass of a population, how, or if you've seen ways that are feasible for integrating into those areas.
So circuit rider programs, I think, have been relatively successful, where you've got somebody who's hired specifically to go into those lower capacity communities. And a part of their job is to take that community through the process to articulate what they need and what their vision is. That's essentially, honestly, what we were doing with all of the project development, the retrofits work that we did. That was us just kind of raising our hand and saying, somebody needs to come alongside of these communities who are so stretched thin. Churches, schools, et cetera, that don't have the capacity to think about, retrofitting their property with green stormwater infrastructure, but the utility wasn't providing that support to them. So we went to the Kresge Foundation and said, hey, if we were able to resource us to be able to go into these communities and walk alongside of them, we could ensure that those resources are being directed to these communities. And that's what's generated the results that we got.
That's great. Okay. We are going to unfortunately have to leave it there because we've got a million things to do today. April, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Super inspirational. You've seen encouragement in the chat as well from other council members. So thanks, and please be in touch. It sounds like Erica and others will likely be in touch with you going forward. So thanks so much, April. You're welcome to stick around, and we also release you if you've got other things to do with your morning.
Sounds good. Wonderful. Have a great meeting.
Yeah, thanks, April. Okay, so thanks, everyone. Now, we need to do a very interesting piece of work, which is to share with each other a whole lot of thinking and work that's happened. Today is a remarkable milestone for all of us in the climate, for all of you in the Climate Council, and all of us who have been helping guide this process. We have things to share with each other. Jane's going to kick us off by giving an overview of sort of what would come in front of all of these presentations. And I'll let Jane explain a little bit more the logic behind all that. And then we're going to need to efficiently, but yet profoundly, look at what each other have done on pathways and strategies. So I'll be here to help keep that conversation at the right altitude, keep us moving throughout the day. We're already about 5 minutes late, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. And we've got a lot to get through. If you're joining us as a member of the public today or an observer, I'm so glad you're here. This is a really important meeting. We're around noon today. We're going to do public comment. Please stick around until then. As I mentioned at the top of the meeting, if you are observing our meeting today, we'd ask you to keep your camera off and refrain from using the chat until the public comment period. Like I said, we'll be around noon after we've had a chance to hear from all 3 subcommittees that are presenting. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Jane, who's got a presentation that's sort of the prologue, the beginning of the work we're going to see from the 3 subcommittees that are presenting today. Jane, go ahead, please.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, hold on, let me get this up. Okay, so David kicked us off this morning by suggesting that this was an interesting milestone, and I'd like to challenge that and add to that about just really how exciting it feels to be sitting here in front of all of you as you put forward your initial suite of pathways today. It really is an amazing milestone and one that will help us pivot into the final months ahead of us of moving towards adopting our first initial climate action plan. And so for consistency this morning, and to keep us moving and not have these opening slides presented numerous times throughout the morning, my hope is to kick us off, orient you to what we're trying to accomplish today with this initial batch of work, as well as set the stage for what this isn't going to be today, and hopefully tee us up for some good conversation with all of you. This is really intended, these slides will be put forward at the beginning of all of your presentations so that as we post them online, they can all be hopefully standalone documents so that as the public reaches out to look for them, download them, there is a consistent opening set of slides to orient everybody to the body of work that is coming forward today. So with that in mind, at the steering committee meeting, as I presented these slides, it was reminded to me by steering committee members and others that in addition to today's work, we also have already in front of us a Global Warming Solutions Act that sets forward in motion a consistent set of requirements that we're all trying to reach as we develop the climate action plan through the work of the subcommittees. In addition to that, it's important to remind us around what these requirements are in order to build the body of work that you'll be presenting. First and foremost, this first climate action plan needs to be and will be a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors in Vermont. And cross-sector mitigation today will speak to some of those initial pathways and strategies that will hopefully get us there. But a complete climate action plan wouldn't be in and of itself an emissions reduction plan without the complementary work of ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, which will speak to how we build a resilient state as well as sequester carbon. Along the way, we'll mention and encourage smart growth and related strategies. The work will also speak to the long-term sequestration. Again, trying to get us to net zero emissions by 2050 across all sectors. And they'll, as looking back to what April just spoke about and what we've all spoken about so far to date with respect to just transitions work, thinking about equity through reduction of energy burdens for rural and marginalized communities specifically, as well as limiting the use of chemical substances or products that contribute to climate change and building and encourage climate adaptation and resilience in Vermont. So these 7 charges are clear and articulated in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and hopefully the work that puts forward today will touch on many of these aspects. The Global Warming Solutions Act actually also lays out a very clear sequence for how this work will be accomplished. And I'd like to reflect on that within the context of what the subcommittees have been working on. And so the Global Warming Solutions Act outlined 4 subcommittees in order to accomplish those requirements I just spoke to. And you all as a council also spoke to the addition of science and data, which was clear in the mandate as well. The focus today will be from rural resilience, ag and ecosystems, and cross-sector, as they're the subcommittees building the body of the pathways and strategies and actions that will make up the bulk of the climate action plan, built around and informed by the good work of the Just Transitions and Science and Data Committee as well. Each of those subcommittees have moved forward in a clear and systematic way of getting to this point, which started with the inventory of existing programs, and then moving forward from that, the identification and analyzation of new programs and strategies that will need to meet these aggressive requirements. That's sort of where we're at right now, just pausing there. The work today is really about that, the inventory, the development of new programs and strategies at a high level. We haven't gotten to the actions yet that will be needed. In some cases we have, and we'll start to touch on that. But as I speak to next steps, that's really where we're going in the coming months. That will also include developing financing strategies and ways to implement the work that we split into, if you remember in the draft climate action plan, the work that's ready for immediate implementation, and really the work that we'll refine in greater detail over the coming weeks. Then we'll also have a full batch of other strategies that we'll be thinking about how we move forward with and continue to build upon for future iterations of the climate action plan. The climate action plan will also address monitoring strategies, as well as think about how we move into rulemaking for the agency that will have to be completed next year, as well as how we build a clear picture for the fact that this is not the final only climate action plan, that we will be thinking about how we continue this work and how we build upon it in the future. As after December 1st, we'll be thinking about how we adopt a climate action plan at the very least every 4 years from there. There were many ways to put forward this work, and I know that I perhaps struggled with how to communicate with all of you the framework for building the climate action plan. But at this point, we've settled on pathways and strategies and actions. Pathway being a high level means of achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions or adaptation, resilience, and sequestration goals. And these are written broadly, but pathways should also be stated specifically enough so that it is possible to assess whether progress has been made in achieving them. This is going to be the focus for the conversation today. The idea that the subcommittees are putting forward a full suite of what pathways look like coming out of their subcommittees, with a number of strategies put forward, not intended to be inclusive or representative of every strategy under the pathway, but illustrative in order to demonstrate what a pathway would look like in action. And actions, the operational tasks that we'll be talking about to meet the pathways and strategies, while in some cases subcommittees might sort of dabble in speaking to some of those actions, that's really where the work is yet to be driven. And that work will be informed by the technical analyses we have underway, as well as the public engagement plan that we're embarking on in the coming weeks and months. We would be remiss if we didn't speak to the good equity work that we have focused on as a council with respect to the just transitions. We've been thinking about this as a core component of how we build the pathways and strategies and actions that we put forward in the climate action plan, and thinking about it as how it relates to the other components that we know we need to address as we build effective strategies in the climate action plan. So just a reminder that the term just transitions is a way of framing for government and business action on climate change. Its work encompasses both public policies and business action to deal with the impacts of industry transition away from greenhouse gas emissions for jobs and livelihoods, the transition out, and aims to generate the low or zero greenhouse gas emission jobs and livelihoods of a sustainable society. So this is taken straight from the work of Just Transitions, as is informed and built upon the guiding principles. And we'll speak to later on today's agenda, the work that we're doing to think about how we continue to operationalize and include the guiding principles within the subcommittees as you continue to build out the pathways and strategies that you put forward today. But just as a reminder to speak to them clearly, it's about inclusivity, transparency, and innovative engagement, accountable and restorative ideas, moving at the speed of trust, the idea that we're trying to work with the public to bring them along and include them in this process to build these ideas out, solidarity, thinking about the most impacted first, and how we build a plan that supports workers, families, and communities. As we've thought about this, and as you all have thought about how you build effective strategies and ultimately the actions that will come next, we've also thought about how equity as being core to this work is also a component of other things that we're thinking about as we build an effective climate action plan. So justice and equity are part of the message and integral and reaching some benchmark for how we do this well. But we also need to be thinking about the feasibility of the ideas we put forward, the progress that we're making towards both the greenhouse gas emissions requirements laid out in the law, but also as we think about the measurable goals that we may want to set for resiliency as well as sequestration, how cost effective the ideas are that we're putting forward. That's a fundamental component of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And then of course, we want to be thinking about how we elevate strategies that have co-benefits, that realize multiple ideas across all of the work that you're doing. Again, the way the climate action plan is framed is we're going to think about what ideas are ready for this first plan to move forward with implementation. What are those short-term priorities that we know we have to do? And what are some of the ideas that need further refinement are the long-term priorities in building the strategies to meet mitigation, sequestration, and resilience and adaptation. The process to date, you all in your presentations, some of you have spoken to the process specifically outlined and informed in your subcommittees. But speaking clearly at this moment, the work that you've all done was to think about how the scope of work met the subcommittees as we parsed out the work from the Global Warming Solutions Act, ensuring that all the requirements that I spoke to earlier were going to be covered by a subcommittee, and refining the scope of work that defined your specific subcommittee objectives at the beginning. And that was a really robust process to ensure that we were all working within our swim lanes, but also recognizing how the work would come together across subcommittees. We then focused intentionally on how to develop your subcommittees with respect to the membership that was needed to both bring technical expertise as well as the diversity needed across the state to realize the best pathway strategies to put forward. And those initial ideas were then broken out and explored by task leads within each subcommittee, breaking out the work even further, but recognizing that all of those ideas always came back to the full subcommittee to ensure that presentation and discussion was there with the public engagement component there at the public meeting. And here we are, the pathways are being presented. Again, that's the focus of today's presentation, along with some of the strategies that will make those clearer and concrete for all of you. But again, more work to be done with respect to action. I'm happy to, at this point, to speak to what we see as next steps for subcommittees, and then also just recognizing time and wanting to launch into the meat of your presentations. I also have a slide on public engagement and the process for public engagement, but I'm going to recommend that I'll table that for the end of the day's conversations around further next steps that we'll talk about. But just recognize that today is this amazing milestone where we're presenting the draft pathways and strategies. The idea being in the next week and a half, Marianne and I, working with CBI and others, will consolidate that feedback that you'll all provide to the subcommittees today, and then think about specifically where there are gaps missing in the body of work, and really focus then also in on where the cross-cutting issues are across subcommittees to highlight those for future work to develop those further. We'll also try to recognize where there might be tension in some of the strategies, where some of them might be in conflict with each other, and work to articulate that, tease that out, and figure out how we'll address that in the comprehensive nature of the plan. The next week, the first week of August, that feedback will be presented to subcommittees for subcommittees to take in and think about next steps. specifically for ag and ecosystems and rural resilience in the month of August, you all will be thinking about how your work needs and thinks about a vision, and if that vision can be met through a measurable goal, and what that goal looks like with respect to how you articulate that both through a quantifiable nature as well as a vision. And the other nature that we'll speak about specifically, the other component I should say that we'll speak about with respect to public engagement is the recognition that stakeholder engagement as a key component of the larger public engagement plan has been fleshed out and thought about for cross-sector, mostly because of the recognition of the close ties to the comprehensive energy plan and that timeline. But that same work needs to be done for ag and ecosystems and rural resilience to identify who those key stakeholders are, so that we don't miss the boat on having some specific engagement around your pathways and strategies. So that's really the work after today. And David can speak specifically to how we're going to gather and incorporate feedback from this meeting with respect to the comments and questions that we'll tease out at the end for you all to focus on, as well as synthesize that work. So I'll hold on my public engagement slide and let us shift into the presentations and talk about that at the end of the meeting today.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so that's our overview. Our first set of presentations, first presentation will become from rural resilience. But before we go there, I just, as Jane mentioned, how are we going to collect and talk about this and collect our feedback today? There's a couple things we're going to do in today's meeting when we see each other's work. One is, after each subcommittee, we have about 15 minutes of time to have some initial reflections, particularly focused around what additional information might I need to understand this? Like, how do I, if I'm not part of this subcommittee, I'm just seeing this work now, what questions do I have for the subcommittee to help me understand what they're doing and how it might relate to our work and the other subcommittees? Okay, so that we have this discussion time. At the same time, you all have in your email from this morning, right around 8:10 this morning, 8:15 from me, a link to a shared Google Doc. And if you go into your email and click on that link, that Google Doc is an opportunity, if you have more detailed feedback that we can do in our 15 minutes of discussion, drop it right there. And I will share my screen with it at points during the meeting. So if you're a member of the public, you'll be able to see what's going on in that Google Doc. But we're just using that as a tool if there's more comments that you have, or maybe some specific feedback on a specific issue. That's a great place to drop it. Just write it right in there. And council members feel free to use that. So that's number two. And number three is we've reserved some time after a break and after all three subcommittees have gone to look across all three presentations. So we have 30, 40 minutes at the end there to look at the big questions of like, what are the big themes here, right? What are issues that maybe need to be consolidated, right? What are some ideas that may be in conflict, as Jane says, that we need to wrestle with? Okay, so we do have this moment after all three presentations are over to look across all three and have a dialogue about it. Okay, and obviously we'll have some time, as I mentioned, around noon for public comment as well. Okay, so unless there's questions from folks, and sorry, it's been a while of talking at you, but unless there's questions, I think we should jump right in there. And we'll start with rural resilience. So I'll turn it over to your co-chairs. And I'm not quite sure who's going to be sharing screen here.
I'd like to do the screen sharing from my desk.
Perfect. So what we'll ask of Erica and Catherine is about 15 minutes of presentation. And then we'll have another 15 minutes or so of Q&A and conversations about what we're seeing. So Erica, I'll turn it over to you and take it away, please.
Okay, can I just get a visibility check? Can you see the Vermont Climate Council slide? Okay,
Looks
good.
great. Yep, it's all good. Yep.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Ready. Okay, wonderful. Happy to get this kicked off. I am Erica Borneman, and I'm the Director of Vermont Emergency Management and the co-chair for the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee.
And I am Catherine Dimitrick. I'm the Director of Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and I am the other co-chair of the committee.
So I'm gonna go to the next slide. We have right there listed the committee members on rural resilience and adaptation from really all walks of life. And I just want to take a moment to thank them profusely for their work thus far, because they've given up a lot of time on a weekly basis to help us get to where we are, and our work is not done yet. So I just want to publicly thank them for all of their work because they've been fantastic.
So the process that our committee used is similar to what Jane outlined. We did a very robust inventory of existing programs at the state, regional, and local level, as well as tried to look at some of the private initiatives that were ongoing. We utilized existing studies and past plans to the extent that we can. We really wanted to make sure we didn't duplicate any work that had already happened. And then our different task groups, as they did their work, sought input from various stakeholders along the way. And then finally, our weekly meetings, which I will say are Friday afternoons. So we were a dedicated bunch to meet on Friday afternoons in the summer. Our weekly meetings, we had a very open format with members of the public participating openly rather than just saving it for the last part of each meeting.
So before we move too far into our discussion, we felt it was really necessary to remind folks that the legislature has defined both adaptation and resilience in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So we thought we would just do kind of a gut check here in terms of what definitions we're working with. Sometimes these are related terms and can be used interchangeably. In the emergency management world, hazard mitigation is what would be considered in our world climate adaptation. And that can create confusion when we are discussing climate mitigation, which is another action entirely. Resilience is also another term that gets thrown around, and it is particularly challenging concept to quantitatively measure. For the purposes of our work, we have referenced this definition as well as recognize that resilience has different contexts when applied to different topics such as infrastructure, social and emotional support, fiscal and economic systems, as well as resource capacity. So let's talk about our committee focus. Our committee focus is relatively clear, and we brought many subject matter experts to the table, to the subcommittee to address each of the areas outlined in the Act. Early on in the committee process, we established that not only are we charged with outlining ways in which Vermont must adapt to hazards that are in the process of increasing in scale and complexity, but we also must consider the resources that exist to accomplish that adaptation, both at the local and state level. The photos on this slide demonstrate exactly why we are here and why the subcommittee has put forth the recommendations that they have. Based on the State Emergency Management Plan, hazard identification and risk assessment, fluvial erosion and inundation flooding pose the greatest risk to Vermonters in terms of hazards. Additionally, the National Climate Assessment paints a clear picture that the recent dominant trend in precipitation throughout the Northeast has been towards increases in rainfall intensity, with increases in intensity exceeding those in other regions of the contiguous United States. Further increases in rainfall intensity are expected, with increases in total precipitation expected during the winter and spring, but with little change in the summer. So, unquote, or end quote. The assessment then goes on to discuss the changing seasonality of the Northeast, which plays a role in increased variability, intensity, and frequency of events that include hazards such as extreme ice, snow, heat, cold, wind, drought, and wildfire. These hazards and their impacts pose increased complexity and scope, as well as multiple hazards coinciding with each other. Just take a look at the wildfires out west that have coincided with a nice global pandemic. The Act charges the RRA subcommittee to look at impacts, including but not limited to climate migration, rise of vector-borne diseases, more frequent cyanobacteria blooms, adverse impacts to forest and agricultural soils, forest and crop damage, short and irregular sugaring season, reduction in seasonal snow cover, and variable and rising temperatures that result in uncertain and less snowfall. These are just some of the impacts that Vermont will continue to experience over time, but it's a small subset. And so our charge has been to take a look and make recommendations at the significant effort that's needed to build resilience in our communities.
In addition to the work that we're going to talk about today with the pathways, there's some next steps that our committee will be working on that are a little bit separate from the strategies related to the climate action plan. We are charged with developing a municipal vulnerability index, which assesses municipalities' vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. And we are also charged with recommending tools for municipalities to assess their own preparedness and take some necessary actions. And then we have 2 additional tasks related to making sure that self-identified vulnerable residents are able to be known to emergency providers, as well as looking at the Vermont Emergency Management Program reports and making policy and legislative recommendations based on municipal resilience. So we'll be continuing to work on that in tandem to and parallel with the climate action plan. And then you can see, as what Erica was talking about, many of the work, much of the work that we do overlaps. Many of the hazards have multiple impacts that impact different sectors at the same time. And you'll see through our pathways, the 5 pathways that we have, that some of them do overlap and they intersect. And that's just by design of the work that we are charged with doing. So in our 5 pathways, we have one related to local and regional capacity, strategically investing to improve infrastructure, supporting reduction of fossil fuel use, changing Vermont's land use policies, and ensuring that citizens have access to housing.
We'll go into a bit more detail here. Oh, you're right up, Catherine.
Oh, this one's mine, right? So our first pathway is increasing local and regional capacity, including community and civic networks for resiliency planning and implementation, and addressing the inequities of under-resourced communities. So this pathway really focuses on both the formal and the informal infrastructure of people that exists within our communities, whether it's the formal governance or the volunteer groups or the individual capacity. And you'll see we have several strategies related to this pathway, which I'm not going to read, but we have that up there for you to see. So this one really addresses capacity in the people perspective.
Pathway 2 is proactively and strategically invest to enhance resilience in transportation, communications, water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure statewide. So this is the built infrastructure pathway, and it primarily references built infrastructure resilience through assessment, identification, prioritization, and then investment. It also is primarily, because we're rural resilience and we have a pretty big focus on municipal capacity, you'll see kind of a flavor that our focus is on the built infrastructure that is within the governance in some way of the municipal structure. And I'm not going to read all through these. Like Jane said, they are meant to be illustrative, and I think we're far from done on infrastructure. So the third pathway is supporting the reduction of municipal, school district, and residential fossil fuel use through use in rural areas through equitable best practices that address the unique challenges of rural communities. So we do have some work still to do on this one, especially as we look at the work coming out of cross-sector mitigation and the GHG reduction targets and strategies to achieve those. So really we need to take that work and apply it to how rural communities can best do so and recommend tools for them to do so. That being said, we do have a start here, and we recognize, again, with that capacity issue, that there's a number of, there's a range in Vermont for in terms of capacity, but I think there are some baseline recommendations that we can get to for the entire state.
Excuse me. Pathway number 4 is related to land use policy. So we're recommending changing Vermont's land use policy. So current and future land development is both adaptive and resilient, promotes compact development, enhances the capacity of natural and working lands, and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So in this area, we're really trying to focus on both the built environment, in terms of land use, the built environment, and then the land use regulations that are within the capacity of local, regional, or state government. So rather than the natural lands land use piece, which Ag and Ecosystems is focusing on. So we have some recommendations here related to modernizing statutes, ensuring that state agencies consider climate action, and looking at research and data to help support and measure results. And then finally, we recognize that communities can't be resilient and adaptive if people don't have safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing that's located in location efficient areas with equitable access to what you need for daily living. So we have a suite of strategies related to housing, both from a location perspective as well as a quality and quantity perspective. And we see this as an important piece of ensuring that our communities are resilient and adaptive to climate change impacts.
So that will conclude our slides, and I think we kept it under 15 minutes.
We did. Check my time really well.
So I'm going to end this, and we can go into the discussion portion of the agenda here.
That's great. Thank you both. That's fantastic. And thanks all the subcommittee members, I'm sure, behind all that as well. If Erica, you want to stop share, there you go, thanks. So we have this moment now to ask some questions of Erica and Catherine, particularly, as I said, questions that help us understand what's really being proposed. So that would be my preference for use of this time, is really sort of help all of us understand what's being proposed, and maybe if there's some linkages with, cross-sector or other places, that's a place to go to. But let me just open it up and say initial reactions for Erica and Catherine and the subcommittee, questions for clarification. Give them a lot to think about, Erica and Catherine. What do we think, folks? Chris?
Hey, thanks for your good work on that. On all of that, I guess one of the things I'm wondering on the, especially on like the land use policy revisiting and other things where you brought up, especially municipal capacity. I'm just wondering, has there been much thinking about actually like having a really honest conversation about at what level of government do certain things need to be implemented to actually have them take effect? I know I keep bringing up river corridor policy, like where can that actually get meaningful traction? We tend to have this approach of even on life safety issues, kind of saying there's a municipal option to do this. And of course, towns adopt their own plans. They don't actually, if they don't want regional approval, they don't actually even have to comport with state law. So are we going to are you all at all suggesting we revisit some of these larger structural issues to actually achieve the rural resilience that we're going to need, I guess is the question. That's a
short
huge,
answer-
it's a huge question I'm asking, I know.
No, it's a good question. The short answer is yes. You know, if we had started looking at actions underneath some of these strategies, some of the actions that have been proposed by committee members or stakeholders that we have engaged with include things like whether there needs to be more consistent statewide regulation of some of the hazard areas, or even some of our strategies, you'll see reference some statewide work like statewide housing inspection, or making sure state regulatory programs coordinate and assess climate impacts. So we started to touch on it within the strategies, and I think that the actions, we expect we'll have more about that, and we expect to hear a lot about that in the public engagement portion of our work as well.
Thanks, Catherine.
Erica, did you want to add anything there?
I think you summed it up. I think one of the other areas that we talked a lot about, the role of state government versus local government versus no government at all, was in the community and the support of community and civic networks that we recognize are a really important piece to local resilience, especially in disaster recovery, but just, you know, on a day-to-day basis anyway. And so, you know, kind of figuring out where we can propose strategies and actions that support those networks, but don't necessarily, you know, either take responsibility for them or so anyway, it was just really struggling with the role there.
And then the final thing I'll add is that one of the things that we recognize is that the fact that something doesn't happen at the local level doesn't necessarily always signify a lack of interest, that it may be instead a lack of resources.
Yeah. Secretary Moore?
Just a question about sort of thinking, if you have started to discuss kind of how we're going to break out some of these really big meaty topics in terms of what needs to happen by 2025, 2030, and 2050, appreciating that those are deadlines ascribed to greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, but wondering if there's sort of a logical organization that could be applied to these other important components of the overall climate action work as well.
I'll go first. I think that there's, I think that there is, there are some really tangible areas where we can make significant advancement in, especially when we look at removing vulnerable structures from flood hazard areas. I know I talk about that a lot because of hazard mitigation programs in my shop, but you know, those are, you can take a look at the total exposure within the state, and you can make measurable reductions with the appropriate investment in time and energy and resources. So that's one example. We definitely need to discuss that a bit more in terms of the timelines, though.
And I would say that the communications and electric infrastructure task group also did a really great job of starting to identify those short-term immediate things that could happen.
Great. Richard?
You raise your hand. Yeah, thanks very much. That's a really comprehensive look. You guys are clearly doing a lot of work. I have an offer of support and what might be a thorny question. The offer of support is I'm sure the cross-sector mitigation team would love to connect with you to talk about reducing fossil fuel use in buildings, municipal facilities, schools, etc. That's right in line, as you'll see, with one of the proposals that CSM has been working on. And the question which Yes. I have long kind of mused on without having enough data to know the right answer. It goes like this, you know, Vermont has for many years articulated a smart growth, village-centered growth strategy. And that's frequently mentioned in our work with the Climate Council. But a lot of Vermont's villages have historically been developed in river corridors. And, you know, we're putting, if we concentrate development in those corridors, we're concentrating it where there is increased risk due to flooding. I'm sure that you have given thought to this. How do you square those two things?
That is a thorny question. Yeah, so that's definitely a tricky balance. But there's a myriad of options that can be leveraged. Some of them are land use options. Some of them are flood corridor protections that make a significant difference. And there are a number of projects throughout the state that have been implemented, at least through the hazard mitigation program and a number of other programs that have reduced flood risk in the downstream communities because a holistic approach to alleviating some of that risk was taken. But it's definitely a thorny question, especially when there are a lot of municipalities that are looking at areas to expand development, and it's within the river corridor.
It's one of those areas where one strict policy does not fit all. It's very much an individualized community by community examination that needs to happen to identify whether it's safe and where it's safe to expand this compact mixed use development through combination of floodproofing and hard mitigation measures, as well as the upstream work that Erica mentioned.
Great. Okay. Sue, and then I'm going to turn to Secretary Flynn, who's trying to jump in. But Sue, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for all the good work. And I think my questions are very similar to Rich's. And I do feel like after Irene, we did similar kinds of thinking. So I'm so happy to see this work really coming forward. And not only river corridors, but I think what we really saw was many of our historic downtowns were at the confluence of major rivers. So I do think this is the time that we need to actually look at, and I don't know if it's through your municipal vulnerability index tool that you're developing. We do know high hazard areas, but I think we need to actually begin moving the conversation towards remediation and proactive removal from high risk areas. And I know that we're trying to do that through some of our buyout programs, and we've been successful. But I think those buyout programs have been post events, after two, floods. Then we can actually talk about utilizing these. And I guess I'm hoping that at this moment, we aren't just guessing. We know a lot more than we used to, and we start directing towards safer areas and away from high risk areas, as hard as that is, as thorny as that is. So I just want to support that. One other point, because of the work I now do, thinking a lot about the unhoused population, and I so appreciate your adding access to housing in the strategy. I want to suggest that we include, every time we are talking about building housing and affordable housing, that we're actually thinking about the services for those people who need access. So services for the unhoused population are, I've learned, as important, if not more important, than the actual physical structure. So if we can incorporate that, I'd so appreciate it. Thanks so much for the good work.
Thank you, Sue.
Erica and Catherine, is anything you want to say about that quickly? Or
I think the committee, based on our discussions, would agree with all of that.
excellent. Okay, great. Secretary Flynn.
Thank you, David. Well, as Transportation Secretary, Sue and I think a lot alike, especially in the wake of Irene. So she pretty much said what was on my mind, but I just wanted to say that going back to the slides, I think there's already a tremendous amount of work that's been done, at least with respect to transportation resiliency. We pretty much know in every corridor in Vermont, the work that we've been doing with the Rivers program at DEC, and plus the work that the National Weather Service done. There are many predictive models, based on expected rainfall. And so we really have a pretty good idea, I think, of at least where the infrastructure is vulnerable. Chris started off the conversation about how do we sort of address the local issues. I think, Chris, I'm not trying to frame your comments, and Richard picked up on that, but let's just be candid. We've been having this exact conversation for at least 10 years. And those, Lauren's been involved with this at VEM, certainly Sue, myself, Catherine, you've been part of this. Chris, certainly you lived it through all of it down in your area from Irene, and many of you here on this call that I'm not familiar with personally. But when it comes to local zoning, local decision-making, local control, that is, whether it's thorny, whatever the word we want to use, that is in part where the rub lies, because, the state has just so much input that it can exercise on local decisions, and that's developed that way for a reason. But yet therein lies some of the after effects, where things are done in local communities because the developable land is easier to do something in an area where perhaps is not the best area if you're thinking about the effects of inundation, flooding, or erosive or anything. So, and I frankly have been in a number of meetings, especially since Tropical Storm Irene, and don't have a particularly great answer, but I think that's where the really heavy lift is. And I'm not sure quite how we, move this to the next level. I'm not suggesting we throw in the towel by any means, but I really personally think that that's one of the most important areas that have come from the presentation that Catherine and Erica just shared with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Secretary Flynn.
Thank you.
Lauren, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Catherine and Erica. It's really nice to be all together as a council, seeing what we've all been working on in our respective subcommittees. So I appreciate this meeting and this time. A lot of the comments that have already been flagged are things that I'd want to ask. So I guess I'll just ask one process-based question. Looking at your second pathway, I'm curious if you all went through like a definition process or a prioritization process for what you classified as those priority infrastructure areas.
We have not yet. We did discuss that and appreciated your feedback related to the language of the pathway, because we realized originally there was some critical infrastructure language in there, and realized that is for the layperson, which this plan is really supposed to be for, is to be able to communicate as broadly as possible regarding what the climate action plan is. The word critical infrastructure, critical community infrastructure could actually be relatively controversial, and especially as it relates to what we were trying to communicate within the pathway, that we were really talking about built infrastructure and not necessarily all of the other really important networks and systems that need to be in play, like you mentioned. So we did not do a prioritization process, and frankly, I don't feel that it's the role of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee to do a prioritization exercise for critical infrastructure, because there are systems or any types of infrastructure, because there are systems in place for that. Rather, the role of the climate action plan is to make recommendations on systems that can do that, so that we can prioritize investment in many of those not only built infrastructure, but also support systems that are equally as important.
And to add to that, for example, in the transportation task group, we had a robust discussion about one of the strategies being identifying, prioritizing transportation structures that need to be improved so that they're less vulnerable, and also identifying those ones that maybe have to be the focus of strategic disinvestment or abandoned because it's not worth the cost. And maybe somebody's going to have to drive an extra couple miles, but it's not worth spending $1 million to improve that bridge. So we did have that conversation and recognize we're going to have to start actually making some choices. If everything's important, then nothing is.
Okay. So I would, yeah, it's tough. I would encourage anybody who has additional thoughts on this to use that link that's in the email from me this morning around 8:10 and type it on into that note sheet. I want to thank the Rural Resilience folks, Catherine, Erica, for doing this and being first to go. Let's pivot right now to ag and ecosystems and do another one before we take a break. So,
David, quick question for you.
yeah.
What's our timing in getting comments back to everybody?
Aha. So what we want to do is create a package next week that goes back to the subcommittees with comments. So if you want a little bit of time to sit with this and then fill in that form or send an email to us, let's do it this week, if you could, Chris. Thanks. Okay. So ag and ecosystems, you folks are up. I don't know how you want to share your screen. If you've decided that, Abby and Billy.
Billy's going to share his screen, I believe. Yes, Billy?
Yes, let me just get it going here. Okay, let me know when you can see that.
I can now see
All
that.
good. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, everybody. So here we go. Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee presentation. The co-chairs are myself, representing the coarse farm dairy and the farm and forest sector, and Billy. Billy, want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Billy Coster. I'm the Director of Planning for the Agency of Natural Resources.
Okay, next slide. So here we have our subcommittee members and staff support. I want to take a moment to just note that this was actually a really strategic place for our group as well in developing who we brought on to take on this work. Really trying to think about who we could bring to the table that was either from impacted communities or could bring a really wide breadth of expertise and experience or organizational representation, you know, people who had gone through a number of iterations in their career path, for example, that allowed them to have windows into lots of different agencies or organizations, et cetera. And so this is where we landed. And I think our work is reflective of having a really broad and diverse range of voices and people at the table in developing this work as we move forward. And just want to thank everybody because there was a lot that went into all of this. So our process was guided a lot. I will say we brought on Judy Dow, who is an Abenaki educator and member of the Indigenous Nation. And so a commitment to consensus was really important to this. And we had a lot of discussion about what consensus was really going to mean within our subcommittee. As I spoke to earlier, our membership was really trying to bring in a number of people who were, you know, part of why I, for example, applied to be on the Climate Council was a lot of the time policy is made in isolation of the people who have to carry it out. And obviously in regards to our agriculture and ecosystem sectors, our natural resources, this is really critical that the people who are literally on the ground every day understand what the necessity is of the work in which they're engaging. And so how do we bring in those people? Our task group membership, we also tried to think a lot about this as well. So the counselors or their designees were the leads, and then we had 4 to 5 subcommittee members as well as state staff support for each of the task groups, of which there were 5. We also, our meetings, we tried to structure with a good amount of process and procedure, but also trying to allow for some big brainstorm times. This was an idea of subcommittee member David Mears, who of course has been engaged in lots of these processes for many years. This was a space where, you know, after we had worked through whatever we were talking about, or, you know, it was a time for the subcommittee members to say, this is on my mind, or let's provide an example of a tension point or a conflict that we think might come up as we're working through some of this, and just sort of in an unstructured and open way, talk through what that means, what that feels like to everybody that's here, and how that's manifesting as we're moving through this. So trying to really set up a process where we were bringing forward as much as we possibly could and bumping it up against the conflicts and the tensions inherent within that. And then we also brought in a number of presentations along the way. So Judy did a presentation on traditional ecological knowledge. We heard from UVM in regards to soil science, Vermont climate assessment, and resilience metrics, which were really fascinating, from Chris Koliba. And then as well as a great presentation from ANR and TNC around the Vermont conservation design, resilient and connected networks. And then we wanted to just share with you as well some of the values that we brought forward in informing our work. I'm not going to read through all of them, but again, just really thinking about obviously the deep importance of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, but how does that look for all the species that we have to interact with in an ecosystem, and how can we take care of nature so nature can take care of us? These the 5 R's were something that Judy brought forward that really resonated, I think, with everybody, and we really tried to hold at the center of this: respect, responsibility, reverence, reciprocity, and relationships. And also trying to think about cultural humility and the fact that particularly Indigenous nations had relationships with this land base long before any of us were here, for millennia, really. And, trying to bring in an understanding of the things that we don't know and don't understand, and how to be humble about that. I think I'll leave that there. Also, just as you'll see in some of our strategies and pathways, just really thinking about that this is about the land and the soil and how you keep that at the center, but also that, the people that are interacting with all those things and how we hold them as well so that they can do this work. Next slide. And I think Billy's going to take over after this for a bit.
Thanks, Abby. So these are the 3 areas that we looked at as a subcommittee, and I think the whole Climate Council is focusing their work around: the reduction of emissions, building a landscape and state that can adapt to climate change, that's resilient to climate change, and that our subcommittee had a particular focus on a landscape that sequesters and stores carbon. So that was the frame for our work. In the upper corner of the slide, you see the statutory charge for our subcommittee, which I'm not going to read, but as you'll see, it has several prongs focused on storage and sequestration of carbon, climate adaptation, and ecosystem and community resilience. From that statutory charge, we identified a number of focus areas that our subcommittee were really going to apply our energies towards, and those are listed in those bolded, that bolded list. And from those foci, before I move on, so this slide we wanted to include just to provide some perspective. Obviously Vermont is a highly forested state. We've got a fairly good agricultural component. More than 10% of the state is currently in agricultural production. And this is really our greatest asset. And we wanted to include this slide to show that Vermont is uniquely positioned to adapt and be resilient in a changed climate future. And that our landscape is our single greatest tool in helping to store, sequester carbon, and manage our net emissions. And that every action that the council takes really needs to focus on maintaining these values and increasing them wherever feasible. And then this was a slide that I think all the presentations need to include, talking about what sorts of technical modeling data needs we anticipate having in the future. Our group is going to work with the technical consultant, CATMIS group, to develop the methodology for the carbon budget, which will be an important way for us to help understand the value that landscape provides in sequestering and storing carbon. And then we'll also be involved in conversations around the way the state inventories our emissions going forward, understanding that the current inventory may or may not be well positioned to capture some of the storage and sequestration that comes from our landscape. And proposed strategies and action items will likely also include future modeling and technical analysis to support this work in the future. So with that, we're going to move on to our pathways. And we came up with 7 pathways that we thought were inclusive of all our focus areas and really in a excellent way addressed all the concerns from the members of our subcommittee. And I'm just going to read these quickly, and then we'll go on to look at each one specifically. The first one is to maintain and expand carbon sequestration and storage in Vermont's natural working lands, soils, and waters. So a big focus on storage and sequestration. The second is to sustain, restore, and enhance the health and function of Vermont's natural and working lands, soils, and waters, which support both natural and human communities in adapting to and building resilience for climate change. The third is to support and empower Vermont's farmers, foresters, and land workers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from their operations. To support and empower Vermont's natural and working lands owners, managers, and caretakers to enhance farm and forest viability and make informed decisions to increase resilience and adaptation to climate change. To grow and connect local, sustainable, natural, and working land economies, markets, and food systems, and provide equitable access to them. To shape land use and development that supports landscape scale, carbon sequestration and storage, climate resilience and adaptation, and natural and human communities for a sustainable, equitable future. And finally, to create accessible, equitable research, partnerships, and education to promote shared understanding and invest in sustainable and equitable workforce development for the sectors that depend on and benefit from natural working lands, soils, and waters. So broadly, we're focused on storage and sequestration of carbon, adaptation, and resilience in the landscape, in our public policy, and to supporting the folks who own and manage our landscape to make sure that they're successful in the future. Clicking through each one of them, just a few examples. So with this first one that's really focused on storage and sequestration, we have a number of strategies, and ultimately we'll have action items focused on developing and implementing programs to maintain or increase forest carbon storage, to incentivize forestry and other land and water practices that maintain or increase carbon storage, to support research efforts to track forest fragmentation, parcelization, land conservation, increase tree coverage, expand state programs that support agricultural emissions reductions and agricultural soil sequestration, to increase adaptation of agronomic and grazing practices that work towards these goals, and to develop and implement a state payment for ecosystem services program. On the adaptation and resilience side, really looking to maintain the landscape that we have. So expand funding incentives for conservation of farm, forest, and wetlands, to conserve and protect old forests, to use tools like Vermont Conservation Design to prioritize that work, to promote and incentivize climate adaptive forest management practices, and to expand a number of programs to support farm practices that increase soil organic matter, to improve and incentivize river corridor and floodplain reconnections, and to ensure natural resource restoration practices which support climate mitigation. Now I'll pass it back to Abby.
Okay, so then the next pathway was support and empower Vermont's farmers, foresters in regards to their capacity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So recognizing the fact that this will require technical assistance, capacity, and resources, and thinking about strategic ways that that can be done. This is again where we bring up the emissions inventory to include net emissions to account for the sequestration of carbon. The ability for energy transformation on working lands enterprises. So whether, how can we incentivize and change the way that these enterprises are able to produce energy. And then also thinking about different ways of whether it's methane digesters or solar panels, renewable energy projects on farms, or climate feed management programs and increased grazing and agronomic practices to further reduce, sequester, and store carbon in our lands, soils and waters, I should say. Again, sort of what I was talking about earlier in supporting and empowering the people around this, how do we make sure that these people are supported through technical assistance and funded? It's a similar thing to municipalities. If folks don't have the resources and the capacity to do the work, it's not going to be done. And so how do we ensure that we are getting to our land managers and caretakers the pieces that they need to keep their businesses viable in order to adapt to a changing climate and in order to maintain and further build out our resilience and our sequestration and storage capacity. So Working Lands Enterprise Initiative and viability initiatives require funding, additional research and development, and like I said, technical assistance as well. And then again, the part of this, there was a lot of talk in our group about where the economy fit into all of these things, but the reality is, right, is that we need places to put the products that come off of these lands. And we also want to think about our overall footprint as a state in terms of how we feed people and how we're resourcing our communities. And so growing and connecting local, sustainable, natural working lands, economies, markets, and food systems, and then providing equitable access to them is going to be a really enormous component of this, whether it's in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from, not shipping in food from California as much, or the ability of land managers to continue to do the work that they're, okay, you can see here I'm on a working lands, sorry, chapter just went by. So how do we both provide the capability for people to produce food and then to have the systems into which to place that, and then to ensure that Vermonters have equitable access to those healthy and nourishing local foods, and then the workforce development and fair trade and equitable labor practices regarding the sectors around that. Next slide, which I think is going back to Billy.
Yeah, and this strategy, this pathway focuses on our land use development patterns. And as I said earlier, it's really critical to maintain what we have now. It's our greatest asset. And there's a lot of, I think this pathway is a place where we also have a number of touch points with other subcommittees. But some examples of this pathway would be to update Act 250 and other state land use regulations and planning tools to include climate change criteria to better combat forest fragmentation and forest loss, to incentivize growth in the state's designated centers, and to better address the specific challenges to working land enterprises, to explore a policy of net forest gain in our land use laws and planning goals, to protect farmland, agricultural farmland. And this is one that we saw as a critical one in our subcommittee, to try to minimize the impacts of new renewable energy generation plants on forests and natural lands by incentivizing or requiring siting at other locations, understanding that we will certainly need to expand our in-state generation to meet our targets, that we want to do that in a wise way that limits the extent practical impacts on our other natural assets. And there's a number of other potential strategies here listed below. Abby.
For some reason I can't, oh, there it is. Okay. So also create and support accessible, equitable research partnerships and education to promote a shared understanding. So a lot of, also what I'm sure everybody is aware of, right? There's a lot of education that needs to go into helping people understand why adaptation to a changing climate is really important. And obviously that is a cross-cutting piece around all of the, between all of the subcommittees, but here as well. And so elevating the role that traditional ecological knowledge plays, and making sure that that's understood in terms of how we're prioritizing our funding and our frameworks, promoting workforce development in the working land sector. Again, because we both need to reduce the emissions that we're taking by transporting food here, there, and everywhere. And also the fact that, you know, we talk a lot about ensuring the capabilities of our lands to do these things without realizing that in order for the lands to do a lot of those things, you really need a resourced population and an educated population upon those lands to do those things, whether that is your farming community, your forestry community, or your local community. And you know, how do we create the educational components to bring people in to help them understand how they can be a part of this, the changes that need to happen as we move forward. And so again, there are some, particularly thinking about like at all grade levels, how we can do that, how can we incorporate climate into curriculums, et cetera, et cetera. Is there the next slide? I'm sorry, my internet.
I just forwarded it. So I can, so these are just the links of our materials, nothing exciting there. Then our last slide is just kind of a final point to drive home our pathways. And Abby, you know, why don't you speak to this if you can see it?
Yes. Okay. So just wanting to really put a point on the fact that, you know, comprehensive climate action is going to need to address and elevate our natural working land, soils, and waters as critical for all three of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and the critical triad that all of those play as we move forward. You know, that we can't do one without the other. And I think that there's nowhere that that's more quickly demonstrable than in the natural working lands sector. So thank you. I think that's it for us.
All right. Well, thank you, Abby, and thanks, Billy. Fantastic. All right. This is kind of like a fire hose type day of just like a lot of stuff coming at everybody, right? In that spirit, we do need to take a break at 10:30-ish, but let's do the same kind of conversation we had after rural resilience. Like, what are we thinking? What clarity would be particularly helpful right now for us to understand what's being proposed by this subcommittee? What reactions do we have? What questions do we have right now? And I will note, Chris had put some things in the chat, specific requests, and then a bigger question around the intersection of this and housing, flooding. Richard?
First of all, thanks very much for that comprehensive review. I really want to study the slides. I really appreciate the fact that your recommendations and recognition extends both across natural landscapes and working landscapes, because, you know, for the future of Vermont, paying attention to the viability of working ag lands, working forest lands seems to me to be really critical to achieving the goals that you have focused on. And I just want to thank you for putting them side by side.
Thanks, Richard.
Are there other reactions we have right now to all this? Secretary Flynn.
Thank you. If I knew how to raise my hand, I wouldn't keep bothering you, David. Sorry.
All good.
If I've missed this someplace in all the months we've been talking about this, I apologize. But so here's a question: have there been any studies, or I guess that'd be the right word, but let's say a person owns 15 acres of land, and eventually they decide that they can probably make $10,000 or $12,000 by hiring a logger to come in and just clear some trees, and they're thinking of it really for the money, whether it's to pay their property taxes, cover some debt, kid going to school, who knows what. Are there any studies, or should there be, where we could point to a situation like that where we're not talking about a commercial development, we're not talking about a contract logger per se, but a residential person who just owns some acreage, where they might be incentivized, if not, well, first of all, educated, but incentivized, and could there be a program to incentivize people to perhaps keep trees for sequestration instead of cutting trees for some short-term monetary value? And it's just, I just throw that out there. I don't expect perhaps to have a conclusive answer. It's just something that came to mind when you were going through your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I can, say briefly that, ongoing forest management is typically a good strategy for climate resilience, adaptation, and storage and sequestration. So, sustainable harvesting of trees with the intent of regrowing trees is, I think, generally considered a good strategy. There's ways to customize your management to increase and enhance the storage and sequestration of carbon, and there's certainly some value in leaving trees standing for the long term. So I think we're looking at that whole spectrum of forest management practices, looking at which fit different needs and niches as far as our carbon budget is concerned, and we'll likely have strategies and action items related to education for landowners and incentive programs to manage their land at each step of that spectrum. So, more to come on that, but certainly a great question.
Thanks, Billy.
Chris?
I want to say one thing that Abby mentioned, the importance of maintaining the capacity and the knowledge of how to work locally with the land is critical. I think it's going to be even more critical, probably sooner than we think, if you look at what's happening out west, in addition to people getting tired of breathing smoke for months out of the year. If you look at the West was basically designed during a particularly wet period in the West. It's going to get a lot drier. And anecdotally, I don't know, I've seen a lot more California plates here in Southeast Vermont. I think we're going to probably see some massive shifts before we really realize they're even happening. And to my mind, there's this critical need to tie all this together, which I think we're trying to do. And my comment in the chat was that we really do need to hammer on how do we achieve these compact settlements, and how do we conserve the working lands and natural resources, because right now our path of least resistance in the state, I'm just saying this for folk who don't know it, our path of least resistance in the state is large lot development in rural areas of Vermont, because you don't have places to build significant quantities of housing in compact settlements. We've not made the actual, budgets are the ultimate policy statement. And frankly, we're not there yet. And we're going to have to address governance issues around this. At what level does this actually happen? Not that we wish it would happen, but does it actually happen? And I hope the council, this is one of getting to the larger point about governance structures and other things. They're big, hairy discussions, but honestly, I think there's something we're going to have. And so, but it looks like we're kind of on the edge of getting there, and that's good to see. But Abby, I really appreciated your mentioning of kind of preserving that local knowledge of the place, because you lose that quickly as more people move in. It's not a good or bad thing that people are coming, but too often folk get moved off the land so fast, you actually lose that knowledge of the land, and actually how do you produce food here? How do you produce trees here, and other things like that?
Thanks, Chris. Okay. All right, folks, unless there's something burning that you'd love to say, I think it's time for us to take a break. Please do use that Google Doc as a place to put something. Anson, go ahead, please.
Just quickly, thanks for all the wonderful work on this, both Billy and Abby and all the committee members. And I was delighted to see that you're focusing on a working landscape and just acknowledging the great work that's already underway in helping our climate by our farmers and producers, and building upon some of those programs that are underway. But I think it's important, and what you've done is you've highlighted the fact that farmers and foresters and those in the logging industry can play a really positive role in this discussion. And I think you framed it really nicely with some strong recommendations on building upon what we already have and also developing some new strategies as well. So thank you for your work.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Let's take a proper 15-minute break and be back at 1:15. We're probably gonna run a little bit late today. I'll just signal that. We had planned to end at 12:45. We'll probably end a little closer to the hour. But let's come back at 1:15. I'm gonna drop my screen off and put myself on mute, and we'll see you back here. We'll be starting right at 1:15. So come back a few minutes beforehand and we'll get going again. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Welcome back, folks. Okay, so we've got one more subcommittee to do. This is a subcommittee that got tasked with a lot. It's officially called cross-sector, which means there's multiple sectors. For that reason, we've budgeted about 30 minutes for all of their task leads to present. I'm not quite sure, folks, how you've set it up. But why don't I just turn it over to the co-chairs to describe how they want to present their different pieces to the puzzle here from cross-sector. Let's take up to 30 minutes for presentation, then have some discussion on the back end. So co-chairs, take it away, please.
Richard, go ahead if you'd like to start, and I'll describe the logistics.
Right. Thank you, Peter. So the committee has been working in 4 task groups with task leads. In the what you'll see, the category says they come up. You don't really need to hear from me about that. We've got we have done quite a lot of work and have been developing a number of policy ideas that we'd like to share with the council. And we're looking forward, frankly, to doing it in greater depth in future meetings, because the number of ideas that need to be addressed and the depth of reductions that is required to be achieved under the Global Warming Solutions Act require, I think, the entire council to really bear down on these ideas. We're looking forward to doing it again in greater depth with you all. Something from you, Peter?
Great, thanks, Richard. I would just add that, and I think that we really see this as a starting point for continued conversation, or for an opportunity for continued conversation with all of you and with the public. These are framed in such a way that they provide enough information to engage you all in a meaningful discussion, but not so far baked that we don't have the opportunity for more co-creation. So hope you have lots of questions and good thoughts. There are a number of pieces here. We are going to break down presentations by the task leads. Those were broken down into buildings, electricity, non-energy, sort of a lumping of a few sectors, and then the transportation section. And at the end, we'll talk about a few kind of cross-cutting issues across all pieces that are relevant to the discussion today. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with the buildings group. And so Liz, Ed, I will hand it to you and I'll drive for you. Just let me know when you would like me to flip slides. So let me get that up.
Great, and I think buildings is Christine and David.
Thanks, this is Dave Farnsworth. I assume we're going to do buildings first.
My apologies.
Not a problem. Thank you, Peter. So Madam Chair, council members, members of the public, thanks so much. I appreciate this chance to talk with you all today. My name is Dave Farnsworth. I'm with the Regulatory Assistance Project. And as was just described, I've been working with the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee with Christine Donovan on the building piece of this puzzle. So what I hope to do in the next few minutes is outline for you the challenges, first, of ensuring a just contribution by Vermont's building sector to Global Warming Solutions Act goals, and then talking about, after setting the table there, talking about the big ticket items, so to speak, the pathways that have been discussed earlier today, to provide some additional thoughts on and opportunities about opportunities in this sector. So I guess you could move to the next, please. This is a quick characterization. We've talked about outreach today. We've done a fair bit of outreach, and we hope to do a lot more. We've gotten a lot of very helpful input from folks, and you can see they're listed there, and we have plans for further outreach, which is quickly characterized. Next slide, please. The process steps are similar to the process steps for other subcommittees, and those things are underway. Listening this morning, I'm looking forward to talking with the other subcommittees about the obvious connections between the sort of things we're doing with buildings and the issues that came up in discussions earlier on. We've spent a lot of time with the help of EAN talking about what I'm going to discuss to do the two major pathways. We're talking about weatherization, improving buildings, and addressing carbon intensive fuels that heat buildings, cool buildings, heat water in this state. And that work has been involved, that work has involved at least weekly meetings with people working out some of these strategies, so that I'll go into a little bit more detail in a second. Next slide, please. So let's just get a sense of the challenge here, and Richard pointed it out. It's substantial. The majority of the state's greenhouse gas, building-related greenhouse gas emissions are largely characterized by that orange piece in the middle. You could hit the button twice, I think, Peter, that would do it. And what we've got here, as you can see, 26, 40, and 80% reductions respectively from 2025, 2030, 2050. And I think you could hit the button once more. I knew that that arrow would move. The point is, I wanted to point down to that very thin slice of orange. That's where we're headed. We have a lot of carbon to reduce there. And I just want to emphasize here that we recognize that new buildings are important, but that largely this exercise is a focus on existing buildings. Over 250,000 residential buildings, for example, in this state. There's a fair bit of work to be done. Next slide, please. EAN's modeling, which has been really, really helpful, suggests that in addition to weatherization, replacing existing weatherization on the right. I beg your pardon. I think this slide is a little messed up. Could you hit it once more, Peter? Okay, and I'm going to ask you to go backwards. I beg your pardon. The EAN modeling suggests here, as you can see, you've got 4 columns, 20, 25, 30, and 50. That a fair bit of reductions need to happen, not only with buildings, but with the fuels that we're talking about here. And the blue columns here are the overall energy use of buildings. And you can see that decreases between current time out to 2050. The orange column in the center is the carbon fuel that we're using, carbon-based fuel that we're using right now, and that over the period will decrease. That's BTUs, and you can see that as that orange line decreases in the middle, the next column, the green, which is the low carbon fuels, needs to increase significantly. So by the time you're out to 2050, the blue, you've reduced the overall energy use, but the energy you're using now is lower carbon, the green rather than that orange. The yellow line is metric tons of CO2 reduced over that time period. And as you can see, it's an aggressive amount of reduction. I want to emphasize that we're talking here about preliminary observations. EAN's work's been really fabulous. It's the best work out there, but we obviously are going to be working with Energy Futures Group and Cadmus to put a sharper focus on this, to get a better sense of the numbers. And we're going to be sharing this with others to hopefully include their perspectives in what needs to happen with respect to building reductions. Next slide, please. I wanted to point out here that scaling, as if it isn't clear already, scaling is going to be very important to this. And it's just going to be the key challenge. Achieving these mandated reductions through these pathways calls for really aggressive action. If you look at the 2030 column, weatherization needs to ramp up from where we are today by 5.5 times what we're doing today. Obviously, that's a huge step. In the last 10 years, we have gotten to the 27,000 figure of weatherized buildings in Vermont. So not only do we need to ramp up, but we're going to find that we need to accelerate that effort. It doesn't mean that we have to continue at the same pace. Obviously, if we focus more heavily on this, we will be able to speed up the delivery of these results. For example, heat pumps. If you see over in 2018, that 13,000 number of heat pumps, that came along in 5 years. So it's very possible that we'll be able to speed this up and hopefully not go at the same rate that we've been going so far. But scaling is obviously going to be a challenge. Next slide. Before I talk about the two pathways in a little bit more detail, I just wanted to point out some initial thoughts that are really important here. We've heard this in other presentations today, and that is program design is really going to be where, so to speak, the rubber hits the road. It'd be very important to make sure that we get these results in ways that we want to see them roll out. Workforce development is going to be a very important part of this, and obviously realistic funding. I use the word realistic. We all know that means significant funding is going to have to go into this if we want to achieve these goals with our buildings. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this boils down very simply as we look at this from 10,000 feet into improving our buildings and improving the way we heat and cool those buildings and heat water. I'm going to focus on 1 and 2 in the next few slides, but I want to emphasize again that there are a number of supporting initiatives that are really important to doing this. And when we go through the outreach that's required here, we'll find out which ones people will support and what looks like, based on the analysis that we get from our experts, what looks like the best way to get at these tons. And that would include a number of these initiatives here that are bulleted below. I won't go into detail with them right at the moment. Next slide, please. So the first pathway, I've talked about this a bit, weatherization at scale. Meeting the needed level of weatherization and building efficiency is going to require financial support, much of which is really not there today. Here are some suggestions. Tariffing itself, on-bill financing, where people who are occupying these spaces, whether they're rental or otherwise, can pay for some of the efficiency investments that are necessary. There's Recovery Act money. I'm going to talk about a clean heat standard that could support this work. I'll include just some of those suggestions here. There are others. I want to emphasize that Vermont, when it comes to weatherization, we're really ahead of the game. And actually, I think we have enviable experience in this state. Capstone Agency, we have BED, Efficiency Vermont, VGS, all have extensive experience doing weatherization, albeit at a smaller scale than what we really need to meet these goals. We have workforce that has been coordinated. Again, it needs to scale up. The Efficiency Excellent Networks, NeighborWorks, places like that. So we have not only the implementation experience, we have the policy expertise, which I think is really good news. And of course, we know that to the degree we improve our buildings, we're going to stimulate Vermont's economy. We're going to make it easier for folks to live in homes that maybe weren't so good before. And that'll lower energy bills and make homes safer and more comfortable. So I think properly focused, this investment in our buildings and our labor force will have all these positive effects on the entire state, but also especially on vulnerable communities around the state. Next, please. And with, well, I just wanted to toss that box in, but with the support, it's just important. I just want to emphasize the workforce on that last slide. It's important to recognize that the workforce is going to have to be supported, but it's not an impossible task. You recall 10 years ago, we had these same questions about the workforce needed to install solar resources in this state, and that workforce was built up. So I think we can do this in a similar manner. The second pathway here is called the Clean Heat Standard. Rather than promoting a carbon tax, as some have suggested, we recommend adopting this clean heat standard. It's a performance standard. It's a lot like a renewable portfolio standard, if you will. It would apply to providers of fossil heating fuels in Vermont and require them to deliver fuels that gradually reduce their carbon content. Because it's a performance standard, companies are given a choice of how to best comply with this. It allows them to get credit for their adoption of low carbon fuels like biodiesel, renewable natural gas, and energy, just electricity, using more electricity. I think it's important to recognize that when you have a performance standard, it allows the companies to make their choices as to how best to comply. It gives the opportunity to consumers to decide what works best for them and how to engage with energy providers to achieve those choices. So this basically concludes my presentation. I want to reiterate that this is just the starting point. We look forward to engaging with others to ensure that this work promotes not just the carbon goals, but a just transition that we want to secure here for Vermonters. And with that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. So I think, Peter, what we're going to do is roll forward and do all, and then do a consolidated set of questions. But I will say to council members, take some notes. Don't forget the thought you had right now listening to Dave in the buildings presentation. But let's consolidate all these task groups and keep rolling. So what's up next, Peter? Sorry, you're on mute if you're trying to speak.
We'll be moving to the electricity sector once I figure out why PowerPoint is such a pain to do for multiple screens. All right, can somebody confirm you can see that, because I've lost you all altogether?
We can see.
All right,
You're good. We got it.
All right, now it's Liz and Ed. My apologies for this.
Yeah, no, that's great. Hi, everybody. Ed McNamara and I took the lead on the electricity task force, and we can try to go through these pretty quickly because the overall view on the electric side is that we are supportive of the efforts for other sectors given the relatively clean portfolio we have in electricity now. So we can advance slide. Maybe, there we go. Like others, we used the really great expertise on the subcommittee itself, primarily also have consulted with our regional lead at ISO New England and a few of the energy developers who are in the state now, with a lot more to go. We're working on these recommendations in coordination with the Department of Public Service that is going through its comprehensive energy plan process right now. And so much of the outreach work regarding the comprehensive energy plan will dovetail with this work and will happen in the August and September timeframe. Go ahead and advance. Same process as others that you've seen, so we don't need to take time on this one right now. If you could go forward. And, again, we're familiar with the relative contribution of the various sectors. If you advance the slide and do it one more time, you'll see that that electricity focus really is on this. It's on the small blue line there, which, if you think about it, really illustrates the possibility, because if you can imagine the orange and the green sections primarily shrinking down so that they become more electrified, you can think about the carbon impact that will have. It would reflect essentially the carbon portfolio of what electricity has now and would significantly help to decarbonize the state. So thinking about continued progress in the electricity sector to help enable that is really the key to the goals here. Advance again. And for this purpose, we've developed 3 pathways that are proposed at this point. The first is to achieve 100% renewable electricity supply statewide, which is an increase from the current statutory goal of 75%, in order to keep that progress going and then help with that decarbonization in those other sectors. And the other 2 pathways are designed to ensure that that can be done cost effectively and in a way that will promote equity for all Vermonters. First, by promoting flexible load management, which will help maximize the benefit of electrification as other sectors decarbonize. And then also to enable what we're calling electrification for all, which is really to make sure all Vermonters at both their individual residence and business levels, as well as at the community level, can benefit from this transition. Advanced slide. And I'm going to turn it over to Ed to talk about the first pathway, the 100% renewable electricity supply.
Great, thanks, Liz. So just a little bit of context. There is an existing renewable energy standard in effect. It's about 67% right now, increasing to 75% by 2032. The existing power supply is relatively carbon-free, 94%, with 27% of that being nuclear, 67% renewable. And one of the benefits of a renewable energy standard is because it's a percentage of the electric load, it keeps pace with the electrification that we need to see in transportation and building sectors as well. We had recommended focusing on renewable energy standard rather than carbon-free energy standard, as some other states have done, just recognizing where we are as a state. Next slide, please. So we're not recommending right now a specific design to 100% renewable energy standard. There's a lot of different design considerations that really need to be thoroughly discussed. It's also important to remember that this is something that the legislature needs to decide. The existing renewable energy standard is set in statute. Amendments will need to be modified by statute. So some of the things that we need to discuss are, to what extent the in-state requirements versus delivery from anywhere in the New England grid or capable of delivering into the grid. Diversity of supply considerations. Need a large number of different technologies able to provide resources, provide renewable energy. To what extent are we going to continue focusing on existing renewables versus looking at new resources? Need to balance both of those. Looking at a measurement period, there's 8760 hours in a year, and we need to have electricity whenever the lights are on, including in the winter time when we expect to see most new load from transportation and from heat pumps. Going to skip over the speed program, can talk about that if folks are really interested. And then also importantly, how to design a res so that that electricity remains cost effective compared to fossil fuel. So one of the things that we're recommending is that we really have a discussion on these trade-offs, these different design parameters, and try to reach some common agreements to the extent possible to help with better facilitated coherent conversation at the legislature as to what a 100% renewable energy standard would look like. Next slide, please. I'll turn it back to Liz.
Sure, and the other two pathways, just briefly, promoting flexible load management so that we can maximize the benefit of electrification really will help make sure that the cost impacts of electrifying that might otherwise come about if we, for example, did it in a way that impacted the ability of the grid to manage that increased electric use. We really need to make sure that we manage that so that the transition can be as cost effective as possible. It also will help create more carbon reduction by doing it that way. So there are some strategies that are listed here with the check marks, and we did go down to potential action levels with the 4 examples after each one. Cost-effective direct load control programs that are managed primarily by our electric utilities, but also can be energy service company programs where devices are provided to customers and then managed directly either by the utility or by the energy service company. Those are really effective both to increase resiliency for individual customers as well as to provide grid management level services to help lower costs for everybody. Also making sure that as we go forward, we encourage customer programs that help match load and generation. So traditionally, we've thought about using electricity right in the middle of the day as the most expensive time, the quote peak time. But with solar, especially increasingly available, that reality changes over time. And we really want to make sure that we can have programs that help customers at their individual building level match their load if they have solar on the roof, for example, or a battery available to help balance. And then encouraging rate design, which is just a fancy way of saying that utilities need to have structures where they charge customers that are designed to help promote electrification, such as, for example, electric vehicle charging rates is a typical one people are aware of. And then making sure that overall energy reductions also happen. That's a cross-cutting issue that we've already heard about in the building sector, and it certainly applies here. Next slide. And then enabling electrification for all. You know, this is the third pathway, but that's by no means a ranking. All of these are important. And in fact, in some ways, I and others on our subcommittee see this as really the gateway pathway for the changes that need to occur. We have to help individual Vermonters at their homes and their businesses be able to make the switch. And that's going to require direct investment into our infrastructure so that, for example, 200 amp service can come to Vermonters so that they're ready for vehicle charging when they're at their next vehicle purchase, so that they can install a heat pump or a storage device system. And, you know, that includes broadband, by the way, so that people can stay connected and make sure that the load control programs that we have are beneficial to everyone. So making sure that everything we do focuses on policies and sources that will help Vermonters make that change will be critical to seeing these reductions. And that can occur not just at the individual home and community building level, but also the community level, something that is often called resiliency zones, community level planning, where a community can come together and say, hey, after an Irene style event, for example, are there places in our community that we can specifically build for communications, electricity, and recovery purposes? Making sure there are nodes in communities available for that will help with this transition and also build resiliency at the community level. I think that is it for our section for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed and Liz. Fantastic. Peter, what's up next?
Non-energy is up next, so that's me. Give me one moment. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right, we're gonna blitz through these. This is we lumped several categories of emissions into what we're calling a sort of non-energy piece. Those that are where the burning of fossil fuels is not sort of the direct cause of emissions. Things like our industrial processes, agricultural emissions, our waste emissions from our waste sector. We had good help from staff all over state government, different components of our subcommittee, and I will just speak back to the value of our subcommittee as a whole in terms of the expertise and thoughtfulness that went into that discussion. So this we are talking about, for us, we're talking about the gray, the sort of cranberry colored and yellow bands at the top of your chart here. As was mentioned in the ecosystem subcommittee presentation, how we calculate agriculture emissions, whether we consider net versus gross emissions will be a critical component to how we prioritize actions. So bear that in mind. One of our primary contributors to industrial processing emissions is from our sole microchip manufacturer in the state. Based on a sort of guidance and environmental policy, moving them away from using more hazardous substances, they began using high global warming potential ozone depleting substances alternatives in the sort of early 90s or post baseline year. So their emissions baseline for that value would be 0. And so we need to consider how we account for sort of the way in which processes were changed over the course of time to benefit overall, since there were environmental concerns with the previous chemicals being used. So thoughts to bear in mind. The waste sector actually has, through reductions in emissions from the solid waste sector, has largely met the sort of the obligations to reduce emissions through 2030. And so, but we as a subcommittee talked about looking for ways to reduce emissions from the wastewater sector as well. So we've included those here for your consideration. And then there's some great work in partnership with the United States Climate Alliance, of which Vermont's a member, and other states looking at ways to reduce emissions from our refrigeration activities, which often use high global warming potential chemicals to allow us to cool our food. So more to come there. And then as a reminder, the buildings task, there was one small subset in the inventory on sort of fossil fuel emissions. Those are essentially fugitive methane emissions from natural gas pipelines. And since those were going to feed largely building sector emissions, the buildings team sort of chose to take that under their wing. And so we have not included that here as people are going back and looking at the inventory and they're wondering why that wasn't considered. Talked about those pieces, the ag pieces, especially important. How do we evaluate those global foundries emissions? And then there's some big weighty discussions for the full council as a whole to consider, sort of as we're evaluating the inventory and we're thinking about how we meet these goals. What we choose to count, how we count it really matters because it changes our focus and prioritization. So keep those in mind as we go along. There are a number of pathways here. I'm going to try to blitz through these pretty fast because we're running low on time and transportation is the heaviest group. So I'm happy to answer more questions later, but I do want to give us plenty of time for that. There are a couple of pathways related to our wastewater treatment facilities. Mostly those come in the form of fugitive methane emissions from existing anaerobic and aerobic digestion. So we want to figure out how to capture those and use those for beneficial purposes, or flare them off so that they're less polluting CO2 rather than methane. And then looking at ways to improve the transportation efficiency around wastewater treatment plants. Then again, looking for most communities, their wastewater treatment facility is the highest energy user. And so finding ways to optimize and size pumps and equipment accordingly is really important to reducing a community's overall electricity use. And then I talked about the ozone depleting substitutes as a result of our efforts to remove the use of CFCs, which were causing holes in the ozone. We largely managed a shift to hydrofluorocarbons, the HFCs, and other chemicals that turn out to have huge global warming potential numbers. Well, so in the global use of carbon or of greenhouse gas emissions, we're really seeing the HFC and other short-lived climate pollutants are really the things that are driving up overall emissions globally. So it's something that we really need to pay attention to. As I talked about, we're working with Global Foundries to understand the work that they're already doing. They've made a lot of progress since they began using them, but obviously their sort of baseline is 0 if we're talking about 1990 levels. And so that's a factor that we'll have to consider. I will mention that Global Foundries has applied to the Public Utilities Commission to be regulated as an electric utility. That provides a potential opportunity for us to think holistically about their emissions and have them drive down process emissions rather than simply meeting sort of like, the renewable energy standard or something else. There are different ways to look at it that we could really make some progress on a hard to reach facility. And obviously Global Foundries is one plant in the mix of their whole industry and company. And so trying to understand what's feasible and where the industry is going will be key. And then I'm going to largely run through these quickly. I will say that we are grateful for the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee for developing these ideas to make sure that we had these be inclusive of our overall efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. They are inclusive of both ways to mitigate and to sequester. And so want to share these for your efforts. So there are a number of programs that are already in place that are looking at everything from agronomic and grazing practices and feed management and other pieces that really create an opportunity to rise to scale to meet our needs. There's been a lot of discussion around the payment for ecosystem services model. So there's an opportunity both on the clean water and the climate side to increase the health of our soils, reduce emissions overall, and increase sequestration overall. So that's an exciting opportunity here. One of the best things we can do is to make sure that our farms are present to be able to both grow food and to perform the strong roles they play in mitigating the impacts of climate change. And so farmland conservation and farm viability is an important component. And then simply, help bringing education, outreach, research, and technical assistance to everybody involved in the agricultural sector so that we can help leverage the experience of others to gain opportunities within this important sector in Vermont. And then again, digging deeper into the partnerships, help make sure that those farms that are, that they struggle to keep going and stay viable, help them make the changes that will need them to make, and able to do so in a way that makes them viable. So with that was a really quick run through. We're happy to answer questions, but because that includes essentially three sectors, we want to make sure that we got all those down for you to consider. All right, and last but not least, we will be going to transportation. So let me pull that one up. Oh, and then we have the sort of final slide at the end.
All right, the biggest emissions lift for last.
Yep.
Easy.
All right,
Done.
Joy, are you doing this one?
Yeah, I'm going to start first. I'm going to turn it over to Gina. I just want to start first with appreciating all of the good work and the presentations from rural resilience and adaptation and ag and ecosystems. It's a really important foundation that we look forward to building from. So starting first. Next slide, please, Peter. And introducing myself, I'm Johanna Miller. I lead the Energy and Climate Program at the Vermont Natural Resources Council on the cross-sector mitigation task group with Gina Campoli, who brings decades of transportation of experience to the table, which I think very grateful for, to have a partner in Gina in this work. We have been developing these initial recommendations, building off the tremendous expertise and experience of the mitigation subcommittee itself, as well as meeting weekly as a task group, includes state agency officials, other private and public transportation experts and stakeholders, including representatives from RAP, the UVM Clean Cities Coalition, regional planning commissions, some capstone community action, and others. So we have a lot more work to do to reach into and out to Vermonters. And part of that, as you've heard, will be happening in partnership with the Public Service Department as the Comprehensive Energy Plan update gets underway, and looking forward to, as well as in conjunction with the Just Transition Subcommittee and the Public Engagement Team and their efforts. Next slide, please, Peter. In terms of our process, these initial recommendations have been, really are informed by previous endeavors, including a review and analysis of Vermont's 2 previous climate action plans, most specifically the most recent one from Governor Scott's Climate Action Commission, which focused very deeply on transportation, as well as the state's previous comprehensive energy plans and the existing transportation sort of plans and programs that we have here in Vermont. These are all a critical foundation upon which we have built these initial recommendations. And we've also been looking beyond our borders. I mean, Vermont is undertaking this big task, but we are not doing it, in isolation. We have a lot of partners, as we've heard, in neighboring states that are wrestling with the very same issues. So we have a lot of work to do here, as you can see by this slide. Our component of this is in the green here. We have a lot of work to do. This slide illustrates the carbon contributions of all the sectors, transportation and green. I guess one of the main takeaways I think we'd like to have you take away from this slide is we've got a lot of progress to make. We need much sharper reductions. But the good news is that I think we have a lot of really good programs to build from and some technologies and strategies that we can avail of ourselves of and make more equitable and accessible to many more Vermonters. So next slide, please, Peter. I just want to put a little bit of a finer point on this task group and this component of our shared work together, which is that, as you've heard, transportation is about 40% of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. We are, a pretty rural state. So, what that looks like for us, I think, is we're pretty heavily auto dependent and likely to be for a while. So vehicle electrification is a near-term priority, but we have to go beyond that too. And Gina's going to get into more level of specificity related to that. But it really has to do with increasing vehicle efficiency and really availing ourselves of other non-single occupancy vehicle strategies that make the movement of people and goods less reliant on fossil fuels over time. So that means providing alternatives to the single occupancy vehicle with strategies, investing more in transit and microtransit and walking and biking and rural Ubers and other kinds of creative strategies that we're going to really need to embark on. And again, it means listening from the presentations again this morning, recognizing how important our land use patterns are to a sustainable future, including a sustainable transportation system. So that means really sort of focusing on creating compact, thriving communities with strong urban village centers and conserving our rural natural lands, farms, forests, and those assets for all the different values that they provide. Next slide, please, Peter. And in terms of how we're gonna do this work and do it well, we need a careful analysis of, what's gonna work best, what are the most cost-effective, equitable strategies, how do we really sort of shape different programs and policy designs built on really good data and modeling. You know, sort of in a nutshell, we want to see an evaluation of the state's current investments thus far in different strategies, including electric vehicles and transportation efficiency, good programs like Mileage Smart. How do we build upon those and determine to what extent, you know, they're going to have to be increased or modified or new programs developed to get where we need to go in terms of reducing our the, you know, significant share of our carbon emissions. You know, so we are working with Cadmus, the technical consultant that the state has hired, and that important analysis and conversation is now underway. Next slide, please, Peter, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gina to walk through the high level pathways that we've identified as an initial starting point for where we think, you know, the state should be sort of targeting its strategies, programs, policy design in the transportation arena. And there are about 5 different buckets of those and sort of an overarching set of complementary strategies that you're going to hear a little bit more from Peter at the end that we have identified and really do sort of sync up with some of the strategies that we heard from the other 2 subcommittees this morning. So Gina, take it away and get into a little bit more detail.
Well, hopefully these pathways are familiar to many, maybe not all of you. We're really focusing on road movement of people and goods. We are not talking about ATVs, snow machines, off-road construction vehicles, farm vehicles, ski lifts, lawnmowers. There's a lot of other activity out there. We are strictly talking about the movement of people and goods in our area of concern. Can you go to the next slide, please? So pathway 1 is to increase transportation electrification. We've broken that down on the other slides to deal with light duty cars and trucks, diesel powered buses, heavy duty trucks, and motorcycles, motor scooters, and e-bikes. Our strategies include growing the new and used car market by providing EV purchase incentives aimed first at moderate and low income households, increasing the availability of public EV charging, and making home charging available to all, including renters and multifamily dwellers. The info presented on the right shows the extent of investment necessary. As of currently available data compiled by EAN, there are approximately 4,000 EVs registered in Vermont. That's only 7% of all the cars registered. We would need 46,000 EVs replacing fossil fuel vehicles in order to achieve the 2025 goals. It would mean 1 out of every 4 annual vehicle purchases or leases. If 1 out of every 4 vehicle purchases or leases were electric, we'd hit the target. We believe that determining the cost of EV and other programs and the way to pay for them are issues that can't be delayed. We encourage the council to be ready to present to the public revenue scenarios linked to its recommendations moving forward. And these might include how federal funding opportunities can be maximized, potential public-private partnerships, and identifying and pursuing long-term sustainable revenue sources such as the Regional Transportation Cap and Invest Program, TCI, or Transportation Climate Initiative. Next slide, please. This slide describes public outreach and education and collaboration with car dealers, fleet managers necessary to move the light-duty EV market. Drive Electric Vermont is a great public resource that must continue to be supported and expanded. Next slide, please. The state already participates in 2 critical regulatory and planning programs. It's one of several Section 177 states. This means we've adopted the more stringent California emission standards. We also participate in the Zero Emissions Vehicle Program, ZEV program. It's a multi-state effort to work collaboratively to make EV and heavy-duty technologies available and undertake the planning and research necessary to put state policies in place to grow the ZEV market. Transportation emissions cannot be addressed by Vermont alone. The vehicles and fuels are for the most part not produced here, and much transportation funding is federal. We are a blip in a much larger transportation economy and must work with other states and the federal government to achieve our goals. Regional coordination is a must. Next slide. This slide, we're still on the first pathway, and this is electrification of the heavy duty sector. These strategies are very different than light duty because the technology is not at the same place. We cannot walk into a dealership right now and buy an electrified heavy duty truck, let's say. Parts of it could be electrified, but not running solely on electricity. Encouraging research and development, putting incentives in place for public fleets when the technology is available and affordable, and setting fleet conversion requirements at that time are some of the strategy options. Next slide, please. And as I said, we're also talking about modes other than vehicles, electric e-bikes, scooters, motorcycles. They all have the potential to reduce fossil fueled trips. They can be encouraged through purchase incentives such as the utilities' current e-bike incentive program. Next slide, please. So pathway 2, improving vehicle efficiency. This means that until EVs are available to all, we need to work to get Vermonters into higher miles per gallon cars and trucks to not only reduce emissions, but to save on fuel costs. This means continuing programs such as Mileage Smart for low-income drivers and implementing a fee-based or other disincentive for new vehicles within a vehicle class. Another option suggested by some is to investigate the feasibility of lower truck speeds on the interstates. Next slide, please. Pathway 3 is aimed at replacing conventional petroleum products with lower carbon fuels. We should monitor the potential of low carbon fuels and technologies, explore with other states the possibility of a clean fuel standard for transportation, and continue a dialogue on low carbon alternatives with fleet operators. And this is going on right now through UVM's Vermont Clean Cities program. Next slide. Pathway 4 is summarized as increasing transportation choices. We're a rural state and many Vermonters are car dependent. VMT, that's vehicle miles traveled, is a measure of the cars and trucks on Vermont roadways annually. And the slide as shown on the image on the right. Our VMT is not decreasing, but remains flat. A sustainable and equitable transportation future does not mean simply replacing the trips represented in the state's VMT numbers with electrified vehicles. We must bend the VMT curve downward by getting people out of their cars and using improved alternatives such as transit, car sharing, biking, or walking, as Joey said earlier. It also means making broadband available to all so that telework, telehealth, and more can continue to thrive. We're looking forward to an analysis of the last year in terms of VMT and how the increased use of telework and telehealth has benefited from an emissions perspective. Increasing where and how the state, together with municipalities, Vermont expands its investment in transit, rail, bike, and pedestrian and other programs and infrastructure must be part of the council's deliberations. Next slide. The final pathway, land use and smart growth, is integral to other pathways, and it's been mentioned a couple of times this morning. But for transportation, alternatives such as transit, they just don't work if housing, jobs, schools, stores, and other needs are not within a reasonable distance. The Vermont experience, and this has been going on for decades, supporting the state's long-held land use goals of concentrated mixed-use development surrounded by rural countryside has proven real results. We have vibrant downtowns, walkable neighborhoods, and places where adults and kids can get to school and work without needing a car. Now we need to make sure Vermont's smaller cities, towns, and villages have services and amenities that make them attractive, affordable places for people to live, work, and play. The state's downtown and other programs are an excellent start, but expanding what's offered and directing state and federal infrastructure dollars for water and wastewater so they can grow at the required densities is needed. Also improving coordination between the state, the RPCs, and the towns as they plan for a sustainable transportation future, not just fixed roads and bridges, as is now the case, would really help. Finally, we believe a state land use office or similar interagency entity would get agencies working in a united fashion rather than separately. the same approach that's required to tackle climate change. And with that, we're done.
Fantastic. Okay. Peter, is there some additional pieces to present?
There is a couple more slides and then we'll be done.
Fantastic.
While Peter's putting the slides up, let me just say that to express thanks to all the task leads and all the hard work that the members of the subcommittee have been doing to develop all of these ideas. I mean, there's just an amazing amount of work underneath all these slides. Yeah. Peter.
Thanks, Richard. All right, so just, these are a little small. Sorry, I apologize for them being a little small. One of the, obviously, everything that we're doing in the greenhouse gas emissions reduction space is really an opportunity for greater coordination and work across the sectors, right? As Liz mentioned, the beneficial electrification and the flexible load management piece enable us to make transitions to electric vehicles and to cold climate heat pump and other technology. There's a really, so we need to make sure that we maintain that close coordination, and there's a great opportunity from the work of the Climate Council to really keep that focus on the sort of thinking about not getting into silos, but breaking down, or stovepipes for my friends in the agricultural community, not getting sort of breaking down into our sectors, but really thinking about the opportunities holistically. And then obviously there's some key considerations. You've heard it from some of the task leads, but obviously potential infusion from one-time federal dollars like ARPA money, or if there is money in the course of the infrastructure bill that could be used to support climate policies, that would be a huge opportunity for us to get going in a really meaningful way. But there is going to need to be, to address most of these issues, sustainable long-term public and private dollars flowing into to this work. And so we just want to make sure that we're not there yet as a group, but we all need to keep that in the back of our mind. And as we do more data analysis and understand what what's possible and what's most cost effective, that will play a huge role in what we can get done. And then, to speak to our equity concerns, we want to make sure that we are working through an environmental justice lens and helping to understand the impacts to previous impacts and potential future impacts, and make sure that we're doing that in an equitable fashion. And then there's an opportunity for greater coordination. This council brings together great leadership, but there's also an opportunity within state government in close coordination with the feds and with local and regional partners to make sure that we are managing all of this workload effectively, monitoring it, keeping track where we are, whether we're going to get to our stated requirements, so that we can adjust as needed in advance of getting to those hard numbers. And then as Gina and Joey mentioned, the opportunity to work across state boundaries is of critical importance. We need to make sure that we are working together. There's lots of great ideas that exist in many other jurisdictions in the country and the world, and leveraging that knowledge and those partnerships to achieve greater reductions is key. And then ultimately, as we're thinking about it, what the impact of our new world looks like as we rely more on the opportunity for remote work, telehealth, all of those pieces that ultimately have huge impacts on the number of road miles we drive and the way in which we organize our lives in society. So with that, I will hand it back to you, David. I know we have gone way long, but I think it's important for all of you.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks, everyone. I mean, so much thinking. So we have two opportunities here. One is the sort of clarifying questions that we did when we listened to rural resilience and ag and ecosystems. And then we do want to drive to that higher level analysis, that bigger reflection, looking across all three. I don't want to jump too quickly to that higher level, but I just want to flag where we're going with it. And I'm putting in the chat right now 3 questions, just to sort of keep that in your mind, right? So the 3 ideas of like, what are big ideas that are coming across? Maybe some of those need to be consolidated across the different groups. What are some gaps? You know, we didn't hear it in any of the groups. Why not? Is there something big missing? And then are there some ideas that we heard today that might actually be across purposes, and we need to resolve that tension? So I just flagged that because that's where we want to go in the conversation. Before we go to those 3, are there clarifying questions or other types of feedback that we want to give to the cross-sector folks? Things that jumped out at you from these presentations you'd want to ask a question about or make a comment on? Anything you wrote down on your notepads as we were going? Secretary Moore?
Sure. I have a question about the idea of a clean heat standard, which I find really intriguing, and just would appreciate thoughts on sort of the timeline for actually being able to spin something like that up. It seems like long-term it would serve us extremely well. And I'm just curious if it's been done elsewhere and sort of how long it takes to go from current conditions or status quo to having something like that in place.
Mr. Moore, thanks for that question. I'm going to hand this off to Rich Coward because he has been working steadily with a handful of folks on this. And I think his response will be most helpful.
Oh, it's a great question. One of the advantages of a clean heat standard in Vermont is that it gives a lot of choice to the obliged entities. And in Vermont, we have a lot of experience with rolling out, for example, advanced wood heat systems, as well as heat pumps. And so the technology for heat pumps and technology for pellet stoves and advanced wood chip burners, for example, are things we understand pretty well. So in addition, the biofuels industry is very enthusiastic about this. They think that there's prospects in the near term for blending biofuels into fuel oil and renewable natural gas into the pipeline gas system. So at least in the short term, there's pretty good prospects. The longer term would require, ever deeper penetrations of those clean heat sources. But we would have time to build up the workforce to do it and the expertise to do it. So I think it actually has realistic short and medium term prospects.
Thanks, Rich. Other questions or clarifications for all 4 of these task leads?
Hey, David. Yeah,
Secretary
thank
Young?
you. Sorry about the hand thing. Yes, this is just an incredible presentation and reflects so much work, and thank you to all of you. We know how hard you've worked, and it's really shining through with these presentations. The one I had a couple of notes, and one maybe could wait for the next, but we started out the conversation around new strategies, but there's been a consistent theme throughout each of these presentations that we have existing strategies. And I think somebody just nailed it a little bit ago, that we really do need an assessment of current investments and how we're doing with those, how are we measuring those. And that's one area. I think perhaps it's cross-sector, perhaps it's everybody. I think it would be really helpful to me as an individual, but also I think to the public, to be able to say, we're already doing this, and here's how well we're doing it. Here's how well it's operating or helping us achieve our strategies, our goals, and then here are new strategies. I think it's really just separating out what is enhancement of what we're already doing and what are really new strategies that we want to focus on. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Dave.
Thank you. I think that's a great observation, and given the time, we just really couldn't provide great examples, but your observation is really important, and I just wanted to provide you one. For example, when you think about Capstone, they work for the Office of Economic Opportunity. That agency has a mandate to make sure that family finances are protected and promoted. And weatherization, as a result, is affected by that agency's mandate. They adopt DOE standards for weatherization. So if somebody's up in the attic and they're blowing in insulation, the DOE standard says R45. Now, for a few pennies more, they could do it to R60. The guy's up in the attic, he's blowing in insulation, but he only goes to R45. Something very simple as encouraging OEO to consider carbon as it rolls out its programs, in addition to its existing mandates, would give you benefits at a very low cost. It's just one example.
Thanks, Dave. Gina?
Thanks for making that suggestion, Secretary Young. I'm really keen on looking at our existing programs, let's say in EV infrastructure or other programs we have going on right now, and assessing their effectiveness, and then determining to what extent they need to be scaled up in order to actually achieve the emissions goals, to get the number of vehicles needed to get the emissions goals, and also seeing what we're missing and is there another way to do it, learning from other states, et cetera. So I think you're spot on, and it's something I am trying to talk to the consultants about doing.
Yeah. Thanks, Gina. I will note as well that we have this incredibly ambitious timeline of December 1st, right? And so understanding the level of analysis that can happen prior to December 1st is part of our collective challenge. So how much can we do ahead of that and the decisions we want to be making ahead of that? Chris?
Vermont has, one of the things I love about Vermont is we do have a number of programs available, especially for a small rural state. They have a good track record. To me, the challenge, this gets back to kind of the just transitions principles, is how do we more equitably and evenly distribute that, and universally, frankly, distribute those? Because right now, it really depends heavily upon a community actually having, frequently it's volunteers having the capacity to actually push the town or push the community or work with their neighbors to actually make use of these programs. And right, it's a kind of, set up as a meritocracy, the whoever submits the best proposal for the whatever grant program is available gets the grant. But that could mean that the frontline communities and some of those at most at risk don't have access to the funding because they just don't have the capacity to develop the program. So it's just something we want to keep in mind. Learning from what we've done really well, but also I think the harder part is thinking through how do we change the delivery of some of these programs.
Thanks, Chris. Jared?
Thanks, David. I just want to echo the huge thanks and appreciation to all of the work and thinking that has clearly gone into this. And I just, great presentations. I want to offer one high level thought on a gap that I think we'll want to focus some more attention on. And that is, when I think ahead to December and us all as climate counselors having the confidence to vote to put forward a climate action plan that we're confident will meet our charge, will actually achieve the legally binding emissions reduction requirements in a cost-effective and equitable way. I think, we're all going to be thinking, to what degree of confidence do we have that this plan's pathways, strategies, and actions add up and will meet those goals? And when I compare that to what we just heard, I think one of the things we're going to need to look a little bit more carefully at is there are some things that create a regulatory framework or a policy or a performance standard that give policymakers, that give Vermonters, that give businesses real clarity on the emissions reductions will achieve, and therefore, the related energy cost reductions and associated benefits. And the top two in my mind in that category are the renewable energy standard and a possible clean heat standard. We're setting a standard that provides market clarity that we know we will achieve. I think that everything that Joey and Gina laid out for the transportation sector in terms of the pathways, the components of some of the strategies we'll want, including Transportation and Climate Initiative, California emissions standards, zero emissions vehicle incentives, smart growth policy. I think all of that is right. The question that remains in my mind is what are the actions, or what is that regulatory framework or equivalent performance standard and requirement that gives us the clarity and confidence that all of that will add up to actual transportation sector emissions reductions. Because a lot of those things are they're essential components, but I think we're going to need to figure out that mechanism that actually assures the clarity and gives that kind of market clarity for policymakers, Vermonters, and businesses, especially in that sector.
Thanks, Jared. Bit of a puzzle. And I don't know, Joey and Gina, if you've thought about that, or you want to say anything about that, but I just.
I mean, I guess I would say that I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like we're not at this moment yet wanting to just be sort of in conversation with you all and not get out too far in front of the public engagement process. But I would fundamentally agree, certainly have some thoughts, look forward to the right moment to share those, but also just to sort of underscore, like, we've made a lot of progress in the electric sector, and that wasn't by accident. That was by good public policy and public support for that, and innovation through our electrical utilities. And I think we have a lot of Vermonters who are stepping up to the plate and willing and ready to do that in other sectors. So I think that's the opportunity we have before us, and that's the conversation I'm looking forward to, and getting into that level of specificity related to what are those regulatory other approaches that require progress, but also maximize the opportunity in that progress.
Yeah, I like to think of the strategies as the how, and the actions are the what. So we're still at the sort of these big picture, the big picture level, but then we need to really drill down and figure out what those regulatory structures might look like. Can we do that in the next 4 or 5 months? I don't know. It's going to be a huge task, and we're going to have to set some priorities.
Iris, please.
Yeah, this might be more of a process thing, but I think that one of the gaps and the things I'm looking for that I'm not quite seeing, and we might be getting into this in a minute, and I mean, not today, but later in this process is funding. I think it's a tough conversation that I want to see us having. I think that maybe we haven't been having it enough, and or maybe I'm just not in it. But I think we need to have a blunt conversation about like ongoing and state funding and sources of revenue that aren't just one-time federal dollars, because I really want to see some just sustainable sources of funding for this work that are just, I guess, sustainable, and starting that investment now, because we know that if we wait till later and we don't start those ongoing investments now, they're going to not make as much of a difference. And then also, I think that that's something we need to think about now as well, because otherwise we might just end up relying on those one-time federal dollars for the initial parts of this plan. And I just want to see us get those set up and start talking about revenue sources so that we can do some of this work that's going to cost a lot of money.
Thanks, Iris. Yeah. Kelly?
Hold on a second. I have a baby that's crying. Try to keep him quiet. I was going to say something very similar, Iris. Thanks for bringing that up. I know it's part of the process later, but I think Chris said something really good. Oh, good. Wait. Chris said something really good. Budgets are the ultimate policy statement. And I was thinking about how funding is often a big barrier for equity. And, we can, once it comes to an individual having to make a decision, or even, putting on my small business owner hat, small businesses often don't have the cash flow to be able to make some of these good decisions, and they end up making decisions that are not in line with some of the policies that we're going to be trying to put forward. So if there's not funding there, that last step may not happen. And so I think it's an equity consideration that we make sure things are properly and fully funded. So that's going to be a big, tough conversation. And I know it's farther down the road, but yeah, I wanted to also flag that. And then one other thing, I saw that we were talking about broadband and like whether, or talking about telecommunications and whether we saw a difference as people were working from home during the pandemic. And I didn't know if anyone, and I'm not sure if this fits in cross-sector mitigation or where, but looking at investing in broadband as a climate action technique that we could be using. So those were the two things I wanted to bring up.
Thanks, Kelly. Abby?
Thanks. So I would love to just put an even finer point on what Kelly and Chris particularly said. And I guess I'm trying to think of how to frame this productively and not, how are we going to measure our success within the lens of equity? Because I am coming from a rural border town. I know, to Chris's point, unless it is being done by volunteers, this work is not being done. The funding is not making it here, or the will, or however you want to put this. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. This community was hit very hard by Irene. And there was a lot of support around Irene, but it also, we just need to make sure that however we're setting up the models for funding, to Kelly's point, does not mean that small business is eradicated because it can't meet those standards. We tend to put in regulatory components to try to help, to try to say like, we need people to meet this. And that's really important. But in addition to setting up the law, in addition to putting the policy and the regulation there, you have to understand that in order for it to be equitably met, it has to be resourced appropriately. And, thinking about transportation particularly, I've already driven, I don't know how many miles, at least 14 miles today to get my kids to camp. Our settings are not set up at this moment in ways to make those changes possible and feasible for frontline communities. And I just really think, I'm not trying to be negative, and there are a lot of really amazing programs. There is a lot of amazing work being done in this regard, and yet it is still not reaching a lot of the frontline communities that it desperately needs to reach. And so, do we have metrics to know how we have reached those communities? How are we making sure that we have gotten there, that those programs are reaching there, that people in my community even know about weatherization, or that it's far less money for them to buy an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion vehicle? Though I don't know that is happening here. And if it is, I am not aware of it, and I am quite privileged. So that seems problematic to me still, and means that, there are still a lot of things that we're missing here in how we're reaching the entirety of Vermont's population in this regard.
Thanks, Abby. Rich?
I'm appreciating all of the comments that we just heard concerning funding, and especially the equitable distribution of opportunities that are associated with both how money would be raised and how money would be spent to implement the climate action plan. And I just want to underscore, I'm fully in agreement with the comments just made, that we're going to have to look across a variety of programs to figure out what's cost effective, what's most cost effective, what's most important, and what's most equitable when we finally put together a portfolio of recommendations. The legislature, of course, will also have to go through the same process. One positive note to make is that, we are presently spending a huge amount of money on fossil fuels. And we have the opportunity to reduce those bills as we transition to cleaner sources of energy, heat, transportation, what have you. So I think it's important for us always to keep in mind how much can we save and how much additional health and comfort benefits can we deliver to people as we try to maximize the benefits of the transition. I wanted to put out a positive note here that we're spending a huge amount of money on fossil fuels, and we can at least look forward to spending less, redirecting those funds. So I view this as a kind of, I view it as there's a river of money out there, and we need to redirect where it's going.
So we're running a little behind. We are going to transition shortly to public comment, but I want to take another 5 minutes or so, or even 10 minutes if we need it, to finish up this conversation. Joanna, why don't you go ahead, Joey?
Just a few thoughts, appreciating the conversation about the funding. For me, that's a big part of, I feel like we know a lot of the what, and for me, it's like the how. It's like, how are we going to do that? Well, how are we going to pay for things, and how are we going to help ensure that, the people with the greatest energy burden or who have been most impacted, are made more whole, and we mitigate those costs. So the funding component is critical. So I just want to echo and appreciate all the different comments that people are making, and also the positivity that you shared in terms of what we can do in terms of the energy innovations, Rich, about keeping more of our dollars in state. I mean, I think one of the other things when Gina and I and our test group and other partners been thinking about transportation, we've identified regional collaboration. I also want to put a placeholder for a conversation about, as some of our neighboring states and other places are doing this work, a nod to our federal government to underscore the need to, the need for really sending direct economic market signals to the clean energy sector. Right now, we have fossil fuel subsidies written into the US tax code where the renewable sector has to scrap for, investment tax credits and production tax credits. Like, we don't have purview over that, but I do think if we can partner regionally and press our federal government to create a level playing field that will make it possible for smaller states like Vermont to make this transition more equitable, I think is also really important.
Thanks, Joey. Chad, go ahead, please.
Great. Thank you. And good afternoon, everybody at this point. Yeah, I was going to hold off until I thought we were getting into the big ideas, gaps kind of discussion, but it seems like pulling on this thread now makes a lot of sense based on where the conversation has just gone regarding funding. And, I think one of the overarching issues here, one of the overarching big ideas is market signals, and how do we create the right market signals to drive behavior change. And I think, so funding, there's going to be lots of funding out there, ARPA, infrastructure funding, whatever. But, to Iris's point, that could be one and done if we don't play it right, if we don't make the right investments with that money. So I'd like to make sure that whatever recommendations we put forth, have a strong leaning towards market signals. I think if we talk about rate design, that's market signals, an RES, a clean heat standard, the ecosystem services payments that we've discussed this morning, smart growth policies, encouraging more livable, walkable type community development. All of those are market signals. And while there's going to be funding out there, we're going to need to leverage the private sector. We're going to need to create investment opportunities. And market signals have been a really strong way of doing that in the past. I think somebody brought up the solar industry here in Vermont. We created a feed-in tariff through the standard offer 12 years ago. We subsequently created a net metering program based on Green Mountain Power's leadership, indicating that they at that point wanted to see solar generation during the daytime hours. So there's plenty of examples of where positive market signals work. And I'd like to just make sure that we keep that at the forefront, because it's going to be incredibly important that we leverage the private sector to help move the needle on climate here in Vermont.
Thanks, Chad. Okay, so I'm putting in the chat one more time those three big ideas of sort of the, sort of the three buckets of the big ideas, the gaps, and the conflicts. And I wonder if we actually just want to take 30 seconds, all of us, to think just for a second, if there's something we want to say in one of those three buckets. Just take 30 seconds, write a note for yourself, and then drop it in the chat or raise your hand and say it verbally. But I'm gonna give everybody just a moment of silence here to think, what more needs to be said, having heard all those presentations about potential big cross-cutting pieces, the gaps, or things that might be at cross purposes, right? So I'm just gonna go silent for about 30, 60 seconds to let everybody think. Go ahead and drop it in the chat. We'll do one more round verbally, but I'm just gonna be quiet so you can think about what still needs to be said here. Okay. So did anything jump out at folks while you're sitting and thinking about this? Anything that folks want to share? Cross-cutting pieces, gaps. Okay, great. All right, so shall we transition to some public comment? We're getting some in the chat as well already. But why don't we take a moment here and spend about 15 minutes doing public comment. And thanks for everybody who's been patiently waiting to do that. So as folks are doing, go ahead and raise your hands as you're doing, and we'll go through. Let's try to be brief, because I imagine there's going to be, I can already see, 7, 8 hands going up. So let's share the floor when we do this. Jeff Ford, why don't you go ahead and please.
Thank you. I want to say, without an echo, but I don't know if I can do that, that I appreciate your work. I also appreciate the participation that the public has had in this process. There are 90 people here that are participating in this process, and I would encourage you to document that. There's been a lot of public participation in this. I had 3 things that I wanted to say. I'll try to do them very briefly. One is there's oftentimes when we talk about our electric mix in Vermont, we talk about it as a low carbon electric mix. I would suggest to you, and a lot of that is based on large hydro from north of the border. I would encourage you to look at that source as not being zero carbon, but it definitely has a carbon impact. And there is, that electricity will be used no matter whether we use it or don't. There's very little additionality to that. We get much more additionality and lower carbon impact from in-state renewables. The second thing I would encourage you to think about is liquid biofuels. I understand you're looking at it for the clean heat standard. I'm not a big fan of that myself. I do see a role for liquid biofuels, and particularly the heavy heavy vehicle sector because we have fewer alternatives there to get the work done that needs to be done. In heating, we have many technologies that can take the place of liquid fuel based energy. I think it's less necessary in the heating sector. And the third thing that I would suggest to you, and I have to tell you the truth, I get confused between pathways, strategies, and actions. This is a common planning challenge that I have between the different labels. But one thing that I have not heard that does address both strategies or actions and funding is the Transportation Collaborative Initiative, which is a regional program that could provide funding for some of our transportation issues. I haven't heard any talk of that in this process, and I look forward to when that might happen.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I will just say, when you've heard the acronym TCI mentioned a couple of times today, it was reference to that. And thanks for those comments. I'm going to keep moving because I just looked at the number of hands. So thanks for everybody's interest. Annette, you're up next.
Hello, this is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I want to especially focus on the rural resilience presentation, which I thought was excellent. And I really think that that's where we're need to put a lot of effort now, looking at the flooding in Germany and China. I recently came across a case that is kind of a great example of the issues that they were being raised. It happens to be a site for a solar project, but it's at the confluence of, or the intersection of two rivers, and it floods all the time. And the neighbors contacted me the day after the Public Utility Commission evidentiary hearing. They didn't have a clue how to participate. They had nothing in the record. And then they kept sending me pictures of all the flooding, including in winter with blocks of ice. Meanwhile, the PUC can't look at any of that because the record was closed. A&R wanted the fence to be bigger so turtles could get through, but nothing about the flooding. The department and PUC are focused on the aesthetics. And I'm really quite shocked. And then the town is supporting it. And they've never said anything about the flooding. And their zoning map doesn't comply with their town plan map. So it's a fabulous case study. It brings in all these issues. It's a wellhead source protection area. It's got a private septic line running through it somewhere that nobody knows where it is. In all of this process, somehow dealing with the actual ability to do something and how all the pieces fit together. And if it's going to be at the Public Utility Commission for renewables, to make the process effective in looking at all these issues. And it shouldn't have fallen on the neighbors to be the ones to have to raise these issues, and they didn't do it. So I just wanted to flag that I think that there's a huge challenge that was accurately called out by the presenters, and it's very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette, so much. Appreciate that. Ian Hitchcock is next on my list. Go ahead, Ian, please.
Well, appreciate it, David. And let me echo my thanks for all of the hard work and thinking and good faith efforts that have gone through making this a reality. I've been listening in particularly to the Rural Resilience Subcommittee meetings, and I know you all are trying very hard to make the climate action plan result in climate action changes. So thank you all very much for that. I wanted to largely reiterate and highlight some points that I heard earlier. First of all, one from Chris Campany about the critical importance that local community infrastructure and often volunteer groups play in making any of these things happen. To my mind, one of the key stumbling blocks for Vermont in making some of the great ideas and great plans we have on paper and great aspirations we have on statute reality is a fundamental lack of local capacity and a struggle for there to be resources getting to where they need. Like I heard the passion in Abby's voice when she talked about, you know, communities wanting to get access to these resources and fundamentally not being able to do so. So I see this process and this work as a very important opportunity to try to think about how we enhance local capacity not only in terms of bringing volunteer groups into the process, but making sure that those groups that do exist feel like they have the support they need to know about funding opportunities when they come up, for example, or be able to connect with others that can help support them with their work. Would be remiss if I didn't mention Vermont's energy committees, as I think very well positioned to be partners in this. And I know some folks who serve on energy committees have been following this process, are involved in this call, and really are ready and eager to be engaged, which leads to my second point of wanting to ensure that as this process moves into kind of a broader public engagement, that I would love to see and get a better understanding of how public comments from folks like those volunteers who've been doing this work on the ground for decades, in many cases, how their input can be incorporated into actually changing the substance of the plan and the words on the page, especially given the compressed time frame of a draft plan in December. Would definitely love to know more about that, to be able to communicate with those folks. And then finally, want to echo Iris's and Joey's and others just point about funding. That always seems to be a key and is as a real desperate need. Many of the fantastic adjectives that I heard in these about, strengthening, connecting, implementing often come down to the almighty dollar. So just emphasizing again, I thought the line that like budgets are the strongest policy pronouncements we have, I thought was really apt, and is something I hope that folks will be able to put some serious thought into how we make that money a reality to do some of this work we know we need to do. Thank you all.
Thanks, Ian, so much. Thanks. Vanessa Rule, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Rule. I'm from 350 Vermont. I want to thank you all for your work and the opportunity to comment. It's clear how much work has gone into this. I'm representing Vermonters across the state who are already hard at work doing this transition, and we really need you all to come up with a plan that puts the wind in their sails and isn't more conservative than what the people want. And so I want to echo what Ian said. When we talk about just transition, the needs and the voices of the people need to be front and center. So I'm wondering whether these pathways are going to be shared with them. I think we need more than input. I think that there are many solutions already underway that aren't necessarily factored in. I think that this process, though unbelievable, is still being shaped very much by the limitations of the existing frame, the power in the hands of business and the utilities and sort of existing regulations. And I think we really need to think outside the box. We're being asked to do something heroic here. And I heard a lot of referencing to, sort of the limits, including at the beginning of the presentation with April Mendez. And I think I encourage you all to really think about what needs to be done, not what you think can be done. Specifically, we don't have a clean portfolio with electricity, so we need to count our emissions accurately so that we have a good baseline and actually do what needs to be done. We need carbon-free standards. We need to make sure that we fund this transformation and that we put the transformation in the hands of the people on the ground. Top-down directives and tools isn't going to be enough. And then I just want to echo the Venn diagram concept of really looking at the intersectionality between the subcommittee pathways and building on that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Great. I will just mention everyone should stick around as we talk about next steps, because Jane will be walking through public engagement next steps as well, which I think a lot of you will be interested in. Scott Zenz, please go ahead.
Hello, I come from Thetford. I have in the past been part of the Town Energy Committee, but I'm just coming here today as a citizen in Vermont. And there are two aspects of the agriculture and ecosystems work that drew my attention. When I think about the land in our state and the way that people are moving here, the real estate values are very high, and the access to be able to buy land is really available to those who have a lot of money coming from other places who will not necessarily use the money for agriculture, use the land for agriculture and forestry. There's a lot of land getting locked up at the moment, away from regular Vermonters and away from lower income immigrants to our state. We can see that this is a good place for all people, not just people with lots of money. And I'm really hoping that we can make spaces in this plan to allow people more access to land, not just more access to the food that's produced by moneyed, well-established interests in the state. The second thing that was on my list was that lots of the programs that we have to make sure that land management moves forward is being organized with existing actors who, landowners and large companies that have control of our current land. And that, makes some sense. It's a way for all of us to have, who are interested in this, to have sort of an immediate impact on what happens in the ground. But I'm worried that what it will do is increase the sort of class divide in the state in the long run. I worry that we will continue to skew the distribution of who has access to land and who can be involved in regeneration agriculture and who can be involved with, with working, being able to afford to live in the areas that are, part of the fabric of this state. I thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. I'm just keeping track, knowing how many hands I have up. That's why I'll be butting in a little bit as we get past 2 minutes. So thanks so much, Scott, for those thoughts. Jennifer Ramstetter is up next.
Thank you. And thank you all for the great work that you're doing. I think this really is, as Scott was just saying, it's heroic. And we have a great opportunity here in Vermont to make a big difference and to be leaders in this. I want to turn to the Ag and Ecosystems comment that they are dealing with 94% of the land in Vermont. Between working lands and natural lands, those agricultural and forest and wetland systems represent 94% of the land. And I feel that we really, thinking back to Iris's comment about funding, I think the likelihood is that more funding is going to go to infrastructure, which it needs to do. But we also need to dedicate a lot of resources to that 94% of Vermont, because that's going to make a big difference in terms of what we can do with climate change. And I think Scott's points are so well taken. I think if we think of equity, we're doing a good job, I think, in this Climate Council with considering equity. But at the same time, I think that has the danger of simply being on paper. If we think of Indigenous people and if we think of people of color and their opportunities, for example, in agriculture, in forest systems, they are not as great as many people. And so I think, we need to be really cognizant of that. So again, a shout out to all of you. And I really think we need to focus on the forest and agricultural systems.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I'll turn to Jennifer Deloney as well. I apologize, I mispronounced your last name.
Nope, that's correct. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your really hard work. I'm deeply appreciative. Just want to say, looking at the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee's strategy to minimize the impact of renewable energy siting, which I think is a big deal, as you move forward through the action items, if it's not already under consideration, I'd love to see the state develop a tool like the Long Island Solar Roadmap, which targets identification of low impact siting specifically for solar. The Nature Conservancy was a part of that, so you have someone who could help you if you weren't already looking at it. It includes an interactive map and would be an amazing tool for the state. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Super helpful. Thank you so much. Next on my list is Steve Crawley.
Hi, thanks so much. Well, let me first add my appreciation to everybody else's for all the amazing work that you folks have been doing. It's been really inspiring to see this happen over the last few months. I'd like to make a couple of comments, one in relation to food security and one in relation to renewable energy. With regard to food security, I appreciate the emphasis in the Ag and Ecosystems report on developing local systems. And I wouldn't change a bit of that. I think that's great. But sometimes I wonder if we are really looking at what's potentially coming down the road with regard to climate change. And I'll point to a couple of examples of lessons that we might have learned from the last year. First, we learned from COVID how thin our food security is in Vermont. And I really wonder if we can respond in ways that can avoid 4-hour food lines throughout the state if we do have a food challenge. Second lesson would be looking at the Pacific Northwest. And, you know, sometimes I think we tend to look at climate change as something that is happening gradually. And I think in many ways it is. You look at global averages and it's gradual, but there was nothing gradual about what happened in the Pacific Northwest. I think that's a really important lesson, that this does not happen linearly. It doesn't happen evenly. It could happen here. And who knows when, I think is really the one of the lessons that we have to take away. So I wonder, you know, I guess I feel like our food security needs to address local food, but it can't be just about local food. It has to be about how do we manage things like food shelves, and how do we make sure that the people who have the fewest resources have accessible food resources in those crisis times. So that's a big discussion. We'll leave that right there. The second point I'd like to make is about the renewable energy standard, which was suggested as a major element of the electricity sector's recommendations. And I guess I need to point out that the renewable electricity standard